What does it mean for a civilization to endure, not for centuries, but for thousands of years? Long before the Roman Empire, before the rise of Islam, before the pyramids of Egypt had fallen into ruin, there were people living along the banks of the Yellow River, organizing their lives around the rhythms of flood and harvest, ancestor and ritual. From these early beginnings emerged a civilization that would outlast dynasties, wars, invasions, and revolutions. A civilization that would continually reshape itself, yet hold fast to its own sense of order, identity, and continuity. This is the entire story of ancient China. Let's begin. To understand the beginnings of ancient China, we must go back, far back, to a time before emperors, before writing, and before the idea of a China even existed. Between 7,000 and 2,000 years before the Common Era, scattered communities along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers began to transform the way humans lived. They shifted from hunting and gathering to farming and settling, and in doing so, they laid the earliest foundations for what would later become one of the world's longest continuous civilizations. The Neolithic period in what is now China did not begin in one place or with one group. Instead, it was a gradual and complex process that unfolded over thousands of years, involving different communities and cultures. Among the most important were the Peiligang, Yangshao, and Longshan cultures, names given by modern archaeologists based on the locations where their remains were first discovered. The Peiligang culture, dated to around 7,000 years before the Common Era, is one of the earliest known Neolithic cultures in the Middle Yellow River Valley. These people lived in small villages, farmed millet, raised pigs and dogs, and made simple pottery. Their tools were mostly made of stone and bone, and their burial practices suggest a community that already had social organization and ritual customs. Around 5,000 years before the Common Era, the Yangshao culture emerged in the same region. This culture is known for its fine painted pottery, some of the earliest examples of artistic expression in Chinese history. Archaeological finds from sites like Banpo near modern-day Xi'an show circular houses dug into the ground, surrounded by a ditch, likely for drainage or protection. The layout of these villages, with designated areas for homes, tools, graves, and storage, tells us that people were planning their communities carefully. Farming had become central to life. Millet remained a staple crop, and evidence of silk production and early forms of weaving appear for the first time. What made the Neolithic shift so significant was not just the development of agriculture, but the new forms of social and cultural complexity that came with it. With permanent settlements came new challenges: how to manage food storage, how to resolve disputes, how to organize labor. Leaders may have emerged not by inheritance at first, but by skill, charisma, or religious authority. Over time, some communities grew larger and more hierarchical, and power began to concentrate. By around 3000 BCE, the Longshan culture had begun to dominate parts of the Yellow River Basin. In contrast to the earlier Yangshao, Longshan pottery was thin, polished, and often wheel-made, a sign of advancing technology and specialized craftsmanship. Settlements became larger and more fortified, with rammed earth walls suggesting conflict or the need for defense. Graves also began to vary more widely in size and richness, hinting at growing inequality and a society with clearer status divisions. The Longshan period marks a turning point. We begin to see patterns that foreshadow the political and social structures of later dynasties. Hierarchy, centralized authority, and organized religion. Some Longshan sites, like Taosi, show evidence of early urban planning, astronomical observation platforms, and elite tombs. Though there are no written records from this time, the archaeological evidence tells a story of increasing complexity and control. It is important to recognize that these early cultures were not part of a single unified tradition. They were diverse, spread across different ecological zones, each with its own customs and innovations. Along the Yangtze River to the south, for example, rice cultivation was already underway. The Hemudu and Daxi cultures were building wooden houses on stilts, crafting lacquerware, and thriving in wet, fertile landscapes. These river systems allowed for parallel developments in agriculture, trade, and social organization, even as the North and South remained culturally distinct. Despite these regional differences, certain ideas and technologies began to spread. Pottery styles, jade carving, burial practices. Jade, in particular, became a marker of ritual and power. Even in the Neolithic period, it was treated as a material of spiritual importance, often buried with the dead or shaped into ceremonial objects. Later dynasties would continue this reverence for jade, associating it with purity, immortality, and moral virtue. As these cultures evolved, so did their understanding of the world. Early forms of religious belief likely centered on nature, ancestors, and cosmic cycles. While we do not have written texts, symbols carved into pottery and bones, sometimes called proto-writing, suggest that people were beginning to record ideas or communicate symbolically. These marks are not yet a script, but they point toward the development of writing, which would emerge centuries later. The Neolithic period also laid the groundwork for Chinese social values that would persist for millennia. Family and lineage were central. Ancestor worship began to take shape, reinforcing the idea that the living had obligations to those who came before them. These beliefs would later become core elements of Chinese religion, politics, and philosophy. The causes behind these changes, why some communities became more hierarchical, why others faded, are not always clear. Environmental factors likely played a role. Periods of climate change, flooding, and drought could have pushed people to innovate or migrate. Competition for resources may have led to conflict or alliances. As agriculture became more reliable, populations grew, and so did the need for social organization and leadership. By the end of the third millennium before the Common Era, many of these Neolithic cultures had declined or merged into new forms. Some would contribute directly to the rise of the Xia dynasty, considered by tradition to be China's first dynasty, although its existence remains partly legendary. Others left behind only traces, potsherds, burial mounds, and tools, quiet reminders of the people who built the earliest layers of Chinese civilization. As we leave the Neolithic world behind, we enter a period where the lines between myth and history blur. The Xia dynasty, traditionally regarded as China's first dynasty, sits at the threshold between prehistory and the formal beginnings of Chinese civilization. Though its existence remains debated by scholars, its cultural and ideological legacy would shape Chinese political thought for millennia. The Xia dynasty is said to have ruled from approximately 2070 to 1600 before the Common Era. The primary source for this period comes not from contemporary records, but from much later texts, chief among them the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, written during the Han Dynasty more than 1,000 years later. Sima Qian drew upon oral traditions, court records, and ancient chronicles to construct a lineage of early rulers. The Xia were placed at the head of this dynastic succession. At the center of this tradition stands the figure of Yu the Great. He is remembered not just as a ruler, but as a civilizing hero, an engineer king who mastered the destructive power of water. According to legend, China had long suffered from devastating floods. Before Yu, efforts to contain the floods had failed. Yu's own father, Gun, had tried to block the rivers with dikes and dams, only to be executed when his methods proved unsuccessful. Yu took a different approach. Instead of blocking the waters, he dug channels and irrigation systems to guide them safely through the landscape. This effort reportedly took Yu 13 years. He is said to have passed by his home 3 times during this work, but never entered. So great was his sense of duty. Whether the story is literally true or not, it captures a value that would become central to Chinese political culture: the ruler as a servant of the people, one who earns legitimacy through action and virtue. Yu's success in flood control brought peace and prosperity to the region. In recognition of his accomplishments, the legendary ruler Shun is said to have passed the throne to Yu rather than to his own son. This moment marks a transition in early Chinese political thought, from a model of sage rulers chosen for merit, known as Shang, to hereditary rule. After Yu's death, his son Qi inherited power, breaking the precedent of merit-based succession and establishing a hereditary dynasty. With this shift, the Xia dynasty was born. What followed, according to traditional histories, was a sequence of 17 kings over more than 4 centuries. These rulers are credited with further developments in agriculture, bronze casting, and social organization. Some of the kings are remembered for their virtue and competence, others for their corruption and cruelty. Over time, the dynasty weakened, plagued by decadence and misrule. The last Xia ruler, Ji, is portrayed as a tyrant whose downfall marked the end of his dynasty and the beginning of a new era under the Shang. Although the existence of the Jia remains unconfirmed by direct archaeological evidence, some scholars link it to the Erlitou culture, which flourished in the Yellow River region around the same time. Discovered in the 20th century near the modern city of Luoyang, the Erlitou site revealed the ruins of a highly organized settlement, palatial structures, bronze smelting workshops, jade artifacts, and carefully planned roads. The culture dates from roughly 1900 to 1500 before the Common Era and demonstrates clear social hierarchy, advanced technology, and centralized administration. Erlitou may not definitively prove the Xia dynasty existed in the form described by later historians, but it does show that early states were emerging in northern China during this period, states capable of organizing labor, producing elite goods, and building complex infrastructure. Whether or not these people called themselves Xia, they were laying the foundations for dynastic rule and state formation. What matters then is not just whether the Xia were real in a literal sense, but how the idea of the Xia became real in Chinese political thought. Later dynasties, beginning with the Zhou, used the story of the Xia's rise and fall to justify their own power. The concept of the mandate of heaven, first articulated during the Zhou period, drew directly from the Xia narrative. According to this idea, heaven grants the right to rule based on moral virtue. When a dynasty becomes corrupt or fails to govern well, heaven withdraws its mandate, and a new ruler or dynasty may rise to take its place. The fall of the Xia and the rise of the Shang were framed in these terms. Ji, the final Xia king, was said to be arrogant, wasteful, and oppressive. His downfall was not just a political failure, it was a cosmic one. By losing virtue, he lost the mandate. The Shang, as the new rulers, were seen as restoring moral order. This cyclical view of history, virtue followed by decline, decline followed by renewal, would become central to the Chinese understanding of political legitimacy. The Xia period also reflects another enduring feature of Chinese civilization, the use of history as moral instruction. The stories told about the Xia kings were not just chronicles, they were lessons in leadership. Yu the Great's selflessness stood in contrast to Ji's excesses. The message was clear: good rulers work for the benefit of the people, bad rulers bring chaos. History, even if partly legendary, became a tool for shaping political behavior. In this way, the Xia functioned as a mirror for later generations. Their mythic past was not discarded as primitive or irrelevant. It was folded into the national narrative. Just as ancestors were honored in family rituals, the Xia were honored as cultural ancestors, representing both the promise and the peril of political power. The transition from Neolithic cultures to dynastic rule is not a straight line. It is a mosaic of overlapping stories, evolving technologies, and shifting social forms. But by the time of the Xia, a new pattern had begun to emerge: centralized leadership, moral justification for authority, and an increasingly complex relationship between human society and the natural world. The Xia period may not give us emperors carved in stone or inscriptions in bronze, but it does give us something equally powerful, a template for thinking about governance, legitimacy, and history itself. It offers the first outlines of the Chinese state and the ideas that would sustain it. With the arrival of the Shang dynasty, Chinese history begins to emerge from the shadows of legend and into the light of the archaeological record. The Shang period, traditionally dated from around 1600 to 1046 before the Common Era, marks the first dynasty in Chinese history confirmed by both textual sources and material evidence. This was a civilization shaped by bronze, bound by ritual, and driven by the power of divination. Unlike the Jia, whose existence remains partly mythical, the Shang left behind a remarkable array of tangible remains, royal tombs, palatial buildings, thousands of inscribed oracle bones, and exquisite bronze vessels. These findings give us a rare and detailed window into one of the earliest complex states in East Asia. The heart of the Shang world was located in the central plains of the Yellow River Valley in what is now Henan Province. The final capital of the Shang, known today as Yin, was discovered near the modern city of Anyang. Excavations at this site began in the early 20th century and revealed a sophisticated urban center complete with palaces, workshops, temples, and massive royal tombs. This site, and others like it, confirmed many details found in ancient texts, such as the records of the Grand Historian, allowing historians to align archaeology with tradition for the first time. At the top of Shang society stood the king, who held both political and religious authority. He was not merely a ruler, but the chief intermediary between the human world and the ancestral spirits. Shang kings conducted elaborate rituals, often involving animal and at times human sacrifices, to honor and appease their forebears. These rituals were believed to ensure good harvests, military success, and protection from misfortune. One of the most extraordinary features of Shang culture is its use of oracle bones for divination. These were typically turtle plastrons or ox scapulae that were prepared, inscribed with questions, and then heated until they cracked. The cracks were interpreted as answers from the ancestors or deities. The questions touched on every aspect of Shang life. Will the harvest be good? Should we go to war? Will the king's child be healthy? The king or a diviner would interpret the cracks, and the outcomes were often recorded directly on the bone itself. These inscriptions represent the earliest known form of Chinese writing. Thousands of these oracle bones have survived, providing a direct glimpse into the concerns, beliefs, and daily life of the Shang elite. The characters on these bones are recognizably related to modern Chinese script, marking the beginning of one of the world's longest continuous writing traditions. The Shang were also masters of bronze technology, which became a cornerstone of their political and ritual systems. Bronze was not used for everyday tools or weapons among the common people. It was reserved for elite goods, ritual vessels, weapons, and chariots. The bronzes were cast using piece mold techniques, a process unique to ancient China. This allowed for intricate decoration and standardized production. Many bronze vessels bear inscriptions that name their owners, describe the purpose of the vessel, or record important events. These bronzes were not simply art or tools, they were deeply symbolic. Ritual vessels were used in offerings to ancestors, reinforcing social hierarchies and the legitimacy of elite power. To own and use bronze was to participate in a sacred tradition. In many Shang tombs, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of bronze items were buried with the deceased, signaling their status in both life and death. The Shang military was also formidable. Excavations have uncovered mass graves of warriors and chariots, as well as evidence of weapons manufacturing. The Shang army likely used bronze-tipped spears, daggers, and axes, along with horse-drawn chariots introduced from the northwest. These chariots became essential tools in warfare and were often buried with kings and nobles. Warfare was frequent as the Shang sought to expand their influence and defend their territory from rival tribes and polities. Despite the concentration of power in the hands of the king, Shang society was supported by a broader network of elites, officials, craftsmen, and laborers. Artisans produced the ceramics, jade, bone carvings, and bronzes that filled temples and tombs. Scribes recorded ritual texts and dynastic records. Farmers provided the agricultural base that sustained the economy. The Shang state, though not as centralized as later empires, was a complex and stratified society. Religion and governance were inseparable. Ancestor worship was not just a private matter, It was the ideological glue of the Shang state. The king's ability to communicate with ancestors gave him both spiritual authority and political control. His ancestors were thought to influence the world directly, so obedience to the king was, in essence, obedience to the spirits who governed fate. This idea would remain central in Chinese political thought long after the Shang fell from power. While the core of the Shang state lay in the Yellow River Valley, its influence reached far beyond. Shang goods and cultural practices spread across northern China, influencing or absorbing neighboring groups. Some of these groups adopted Shang burial customs or began producing similar bronze items. Others resisted Shang expansion and were labeled as barbarians in the oracle bones. The interaction between the Shang and these peripheral cultures would later shape the boundaries and self-image of Chinese civilization. The downfall of the Shang, like its rise, is recorded both in tradition and in archaeology. According to later historians, the last Shang king, Di Xin, was a cruel and decadent ruler who lost the favor of heaven. Stories of his excesses, such as a lake of wine and a forest of meat, are likely exaggerated, but they reflect a recurring theme in Chinese historiography, the idea that dynasties fall because of moral failure. Di Xin's actions, whether real or symbolic, were said to have alienated the people and the nobles, paving the way for rebellion. The man who overthrew the Shang was King Wu of Zhou, leader of a powerful state to the west. The Zhou claimed that Di Xin had lost the mandate of heaven and that they were destined to replace him. This marked a dramatic shift in Chinese political ideology. Power was no longer justified by descent alone, but by virtue and the will of heaven. This idea would be used repeatedly by later dynasties to legitimize their rule and condemn their predecessors. Though the Zhou would go on to rule longer than the Shang, they inherited many of the Shang's institutions, technologies, and cultural practices. They adopted the use of bronze for rituals, continued ancestor worship, and maintained a ruling class bound by kinship and shared beliefs. In this way, the Shang dynasty did not disappear. It was absorbed, remembered, and reimagined as part of a continuous Chinese tradition. The fall of the Shang dynasty marked a turning point in ancient Chinese history, not only in terms of political leadership, but in the underlying ideas that justified rule. The Zhou dynasty, which succeeded the Shang around 1046 before the Common Era, introduced a revolutionary concept that would become a pillar of Chinese political thought for the next 3,000 years: the mandate of heaven. The Zhou were originally a semi-nomadic people living in the Wei River Valley to the west of the Shang heartland. Over generations, they rose in power, cultivating strong military forces and building alliances with neighboring tribes. Under the leadership of King Wen of Zhou, they began to openly challenge Shang authority, citing moral decay and misrule under the last Shang king. Although King Wen died before completing this campaign, his son, King Wu, led a coalition that defeated the Shang at the Battle of Muye, thus establishing the Zhou dynasty. What made the Zhou conquest unique was not just military success, but how it was explained. The Zhou claimed that heaven, the supreme cosmic force, had withdrawn its favor from the Shang and bestowed it upon the Zhou. This idea, that heaven grants and withdraws authority based on moral conduct, became known as the mandate of heaven. It was more than a divine right. It was a conditional contract. If a ruler became corrupt, heaven would support rebellion and endorse a new leader. This principle introduced accountability into governance and created a powerful moral framework for both rulers and subjects. The early phase of Zhou rule, known as the Western Zhou period, was characterized by efforts to stabilize the realm and integrate diverse territories. Rather than ruling directly over the vast lands they now controlled, the Zhou adopted a feudal system. Members of the royal family and trusted allies were granted hereditary titles and lands, creating a network of semi-autonomous states that pledged loyalty to the Zhou king. These lords were expected to collect taxes, maintain armies, and uphold Zhou ritual practices. This system was both practical and ideological. It allowed the Zhou to govern a wide area without overextending themselves. while also promoting a sense of unity through shared customs and ancestry. The feudal lords participated in royal ceremonies, paid tribute, and supported the central court in times of war. In return, they maintained their own regional authority, passing it on to their descendants. The entire arrangement was held together by rituals, kinship ties, and the shared belief in the moral duty of rulers. At the center of the Zhou world was the capital at Haojing, near modern-day Xi'an. This urban center became the political and ceremonial heart of the dynasty. The Zhou kings presided over seasonal rituals, hosted diplomatic gatherings, and acted as custodians of cosmic order. Temples and ancestral halls reflected the importance of lineage and continuity, reinforcing the idea that the king was not merely a political figure but a sacred link between heaven and earth. The Zhou also made important advances in administration, law, and culture. Bronze inscriptions from this period reveal the use of early legal codes, land grants, and bureaucratic appointments. The writing system, inherited from the Shang, continued to evolve, with increased standardization and use for recording events and transactions. Zhou bronzes were more restrained in decoration than their Shang predecessors, but were still central to ritual life. They often carried inscriptions that commemorated achievements, recorded decrees, or invoked ancestral blessings. Another major development during the Western Zhou was the codification of social roles and moral expectations. Texts like the Book of Documents and the Book of Songs, later canonized in Confucian tradition, began to take shape. These works reflected a worldview in which harmony, hierarchy, and proper conduct were essential to a well-ordered society. Loyalty to family and ruler, respect for elders, and observance of ritual became key virtues. Despite its achievements, the Zhou feudal system contained the seeds of its own instability. Over time, regional lords grew more powerful and autonomous. As generations passed, these noble families developed their own interests, armies, and alliances. The authority of the central court began to weaken, especially as the line of Zhou kings lost prestige and influence. This gradual decline reached a crisis point in the late 9th and early 8th centuries before the Common Era. In one widely cited event, King Yu of Zhou made a fateful political mistake that exposed the fragility of the system. According to tradition, he dismissed his queen and replaced her with a concubine named Bao Si, who reportedly had little interest in matters of state. To amuse her, the king once lit the beacon towers, emergency signals used to summon allied troops during invasion, as a prank. When the real threat came from Western tribes, the allies did not respond. The capital was attacked, and King Yu was killed. In the aftermath, the Zhou court was forced to relocate eastward to the city of Luoyi, marking the beginning of the Eastern Zhou period. Though the dynasty technically continued, the authority of the Zhou kings was now largely symbolic. Power increasingly rested with the feudal states, who no longer relied on the central government for legitimacy or security. The fall of the Western Zhou marked more than just a political shift. It was a turning point in Chinese civilization. The principles introduced by the Zhou, especially the mandate of heaven, survived, but the old structures of power began to break apart. The centralized vision of rule gave way to a more fragmented and competitive landscape. In the centuries that followed, regional states would jockey for dominance, experiment with new forms of government, and give rise to some of China's most enduring philosophies. The Zhou era is often remembered for its moral idealism and ritual order. It laid the groundwork for the values and institutions that would define Chinese civilization for centuries to come. But it was also an age of transition, where old systems strained under new pressures, and where the tension between unity and division would shape the next great chapter of Chinese history. When the Zhou court moved east to Luoyi in the early 8th century before the Common Era, it marked more than a simple change in capital. It was the beginning of a new political reality. The Eastern Zhou period, lasting from around 770 to 256 before the Common Era, was an era of declining central authority and rising regional powers. This long era is traditionally divided into two phases, the Spring and Autumn period and the later Warring States period. In this section, we focus on the Spring and Autumn period, which stretched from roughly 770 to 476 before the Common Era. It was named after the Spring and Autumn Annals, a chronicle of the state of Lu, traditionally attributed to Confucius. Despite its poetic name, this was a time of mounting disorder, fracturing loyalties, and escalating rivalry among feudal lords. Yet it was also an era of remarkable cultural and intellectual vitality, when some of China's most influential thinkers emerged in response to crisis. The early Eastern Zhou kings still held ritual prestige, but their practical influence had withered. Real power was now in the hands of the feudal states, each ruled by hereditary lords who maintained their own armies, collected their own taxes, and enforced their own laws. These states had been granted land and authority generations earlier by the Zhou royal family. Now, they acted with increasing independence. The Zhou king became more of a ceremonial figure, occasionally called upon to bless alliances or ratify titles, but with little control over events. During the Spring and Autumn period, the number of autonomous states varied, but typically included several dozen competing polities. Among the most significant were Qi, Jin, Chu, Qin, Lu, Song, Zheng, and Wu. These states often formed temporary alliances or waged war against one another in pursuit of territory, prestige, and security. Military campaigns were frequent, and diplomacy became a highly developed art. Sometimes, powerful lords would claim the title of hegemon, or ba, asserting leadership over the other states in defense of the Zhou order, even as they eroded it in practice. One of the earliest and most notable hegemons was Duke Huan of Qi, who ruled in the early 7th century before the Common Era. With the help of his talented minister Guanzhong, he reformed the administration, centralized authority, and built a strong economy and military. Duke Huan led coalitions against external threats and helped mediate disputes among smaller states. Though his power relied on personal charisma and military strength, he became a model for later rulers who sought to restore stability through leadership rather than brute conquest. Other states soon followed suit. In the West, Jin emerged as a military powerhouse, while Chu, located along the Yangtze River, expanded aggressively into central China. Chu had once been seen as a peripheral or barbarian kingdom, but during this period it adopted many of the political and cultural practices of the Zhou world and became a major force. The growing strength of these regional states signaled a new balance of power, one no longer centered around the Zhou royal court. The erosion of centralized control had both destructive and transformative effects. As warfare became more common, states were forced to modernize their armies and improve logistics. Innovations in iron weaponry, cavalry, and chariot tactics began to appear. The growing scale of conflict required better organization, written laws, and more efficient taxation. These pressures encouraged administrative reforms and created new roles for educated officials, managers, and strategists. It was against this backdrop of uncertainty and ambition that Chinese philosophy began to flourish. Thinkers of the time were deeply concerned with questions of order, justice, and the role of the ruler. This was the age of the 100 schools of thought, though most of these intellectual movements emerged more fully in the following Warring States period. Still, the roots of Chinese philosophy were firmly planted during the Spring and Autumn era. The most famous of these thinkers was Confucius, better known in the West as Confucius. Born in the state of Lu around 551 before the Common Era, Confucius lived during a time of widespread political instability and moral decline. He served briefly as a minor official, but spent much of his life traveling among the courts of various states, offering advice and seeking a ruler willing to implement his ideas. Confucius did not seek to invent a new order from scratch. Instead, he looked to the past, to the idealized early Zhou period, as a model of virtue, hierarchy, and harmonious relationships. He emphasized the importance of ritual, lai, filial piety, xiao, and benevolent leadership, ren. According to Confucius, social harmony could be achieved when individuals acted according to their proper roles. with rulers governing wisely, sons honoring parents, and citizens cultivating moral character. At the heart of Confucianism was the belief that good government depended not on coercion but on the moral example of the ruler. If the people are led by laws, he wrote, and punished for breaking them, they will try to avoid punishment but have no sense of shame. If they are led by virtue and guided by ritual, they will not only have shame but will become good. Although Confucius died without seeing his reforms adopted, his teachings were preserved by his students and later compiled into the Analects. These ideas would eventually shape Chinese education, governance, and ethics for centuries, though their immediate influence during his lifetime was limited. Alongside Confucianism, other philosophical traditions began to emerge. In the state of Chu, the figure known as Laozi, a semi-legendary philosopher, was associated with the development of Taoism, or the Way. Taoist thought emphasized harmony with nature, non-interference, and the limits of human knowledge. Where Confucius saw moral cultivation as the path to order, Laozi warned against excessive regulation and artificial norms. The more laws and restrictions there are, the Tao Te Ching declares, the poorer the people become. The contrast between Confucian and Taoist thought reflected broader debates in Chinese society. Should rulers impose order from above or allow it to arise naturally? Was virtue learned or innate? What was the relationship between human intention and the unfolding of the cosmos? In addition to these major schools, other strands of thought also took shape: legalism, mohism, and early forms of diplomacy and military strategy. The strategist Sun Wu, better known as Sun Tzu, is traditionally associated with this period. His text, The Art of War, would become one of the most influential works on military theory in global history. It emphasized flexibility, deception, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. These intellectual developments were not confined to scholars and hermits. Rulers increasingly sought the counsel of philosophers, advisors, and reformers. Some thinkers entered the service of courts, while others founded schools and trained disciples. The growing demand for knowledge and skill contributed to the rise of a new elite, men who gained status not through birth, but through learning and merit. Despite its internal violence and fragmentation, the Spring and Autumn period laid critical foundations for the transformation of China. It challenged old ideas of authority, inspired new visions of governance, and produced a cultural legacy that would resonate across the centuries. As the period drew to a close, the conflicts among the feudal states intensified. By the 5th century before the Common Era, the number of contending states had been reduced to a handful of dominant powers. Warfare had become more systematic, more devastating, and more central to state survival. By the end of the Spring and Autumn period, the ancient Chinese world had been irrevocably transformed. What had once been a loosely organized network of feudal states under nominal Zhou leadership had fractured into a hardened landscape of ambitious powers fighting for survival and supremacy. From this chaos arose the Warring States period, a brutal and dynamic era that lasted from approximately 475 to 221 before the Common Era. This was not simply an age of conflict. It was an age of systemic transformation. Warfare intensified in scale and sophistication, governance structures evolved rapidly, and ideologies shifted to meet the realities of power. The Warring States era set the stage for the unification of China and laid the administrative, military, and philosophical groundwork for the imperial system that would follow. At the start of this period, there were still more than a dozen rival states. Over time, these were reduced through conquest, annexation, and political maneuvering to a core group of 7 dominant powers, often referred to in later histories as the 7 warring states: Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, and Qin. Each of these states sought not just to defend its borders, but to expand aggressively, outmaneuvering rivals through military strength, diplomatic cunning, and internal reform. The long-standing feudal model continued to erode. Hereditary aristocracies lost influence, replaced by professional bureaucracies and military officers selected for merit and loyalty rather than birth. One of the most dramatic changes of the period was the rise of legalism, a political philosophy that rejected the Confucian emphasis on moral virtue and instead focused on strong institutions, clear laws, and harsh punishments. The core belief of legalist thinkers was that people are fundamentally self-interested and that order can only be maintained through strict control. Among the most influential legalist reformers was Shang, a statesman who transformed the western state of Qin in the 4th century before the Common Era. Appointed as chief minister under Duke Zhou of Qin, Shang introduced sweeping reforms that strengthened the central authority, standardized measurements, and created a system of strict rewards and punishments for military and agricultural productivity. He abolished noble privileges, redistributed land, and divided households into units responsible for each other's behavior, a move aimed at enforcing social discipline. These reforms were harsh and often unpopular, but they proved highly effective. Qin became a militarized, disciplined, and efficient state capable of mobilizing vast resources. Shang own downfall, executed after Duke Zhou's death by political enemies, did not undo his legacy. The institutional structures he built remained in place and would eventually power Qin's rise to imperial dominance. Other states also pursued reforms to remain competitive. Wei pioneered military innovation, including the use of cavalry and professional officers. Zhou adopted similar strategies, turning its army into one of the most respected in the region. Qi, situated along the eastern coast, became known for its thriving intellectual circles, particularly at the Jixia Academy, a state-sponsored center of learning that attracted thinkers from across China. Even Chu, once dismissed as culturally distinct, continued expanding its territory and adopting northern administrative practices. As states restructured themselves for total war, the nature of warfare changed. Battles became more organized, involving tens of thousands of soldiers, detailed logistical planning, and advanced weaponry. Iron weaponry replaced bronze. Infantry gained dominance over chariot warfare. Massive fortifications were built, and espionage became an integral part of statecraft. Diplomacy also evolved. States formed and broke alliances, used marriage and hostages to secure deals, and engaged in complex negotiations. The famous tactic of vertical and horizontal alliances, encouraging states to align north-south or east-west to counterbalance power, was debated and promoted by advisors and strategists. Figures like Su Qin and Zhang Yi, skilled in rhetoric and manipulation, traveled between courts offering plans for coalition or betrayal. Amid this violent competition, philosophical thought continued to develop. While Confucianism and Daoism remained influential, new schools arose to address the demands of the age. The legalists, as mentioned, offered clear guidelines for control. The Mohists, followers of Mozi, preached universal love and merit-based governance, sharply criticizing the waste and destruction of war. The school of diplomacy, or Zhonghengjia, produced skilled political strategists. These intellectuals were no longer limited to scholarly retreat. They were increasingly engaged in real-world politics and administration. Another notable trend of the Warring States period was the rise of a merit-based ruling class. Ambitious individuals, regardless of birth, could now rise to high office through talent and achievement. This was a significant departure from the older aristocratic norms. Kings and lords sought out capable men who could manage resources, command armies, or devise strategies. A new social mobility emerged, one shaped by competition but also by opportunity. In this atmosphere, the art of governance matured. States began maintaining detailed census records, land registries, and legal codes. They employed large bureaucracies to manage taxation, corvée labor, grain storage, and infrastructure projects. The ideal ruler became not a distant sage king, but a pragmatic administrator, guided by rational planning and expert advice. Perhaps the clearest example of this evolution is the story of Qin, which emerged as the most powerful of the 7 states by the late 3rd century before the Common Era. Its continued investment in legalist policies, infrastructure, and military discipline gave it a decisive edge over rivals that were slower to reform or divided by internal strife. By the mid-3rd century, Qin's leaders, especially King Zhou, had begun systematically eliminating their rivals. Qin built a reputation for swift and ruthless conquest. It fortified its borders, crushed dissent, and used spies and bribes to destabilize enemy states. Its generals, like Bai Qi, earned a fearsome reputation for tactical brilliance and total war, exemplified by major victories such as the destruction of Zhou's army at the Battle of Changping. Each state's fall followed a similar pattern. Weakened by internal divisions or exhausted by prolonged conflict, they were outmatched by Qin's superior organization and relentless drive. Slowly but surely, Qin absorbed its neighbors, one by one, until only it remained. But before Qin's final triumph, the warring states period left behind a transformed landscape. Feudal aristocracies had been replaced by centralized administrations. Warfare had evolved from honor-based skirmishes to state-run campaigns of attrition. Philosophical debates had shifted from morality to strategy and law. And rulers now measured success not in ancestral legacy, but in conquest, efficiency, and control. When the last of the warring states fell in the late 3rd century before the Common Era, Qin stood alone. Its leader, King Zheng, would declare himself first emperor, uniting the Chinese world for the first time under a single, centralized imperial structure. After centuries of brutal warfare and political fragmentation, the warring states period ended not with a treaty or a compromise, but with the triumph of a single state, Qin. In the year 221 before the Common Era, the ruler of Qin, King Zheng, proclaimed himself Shi Huangdi, meaning first emperor. With that declaration, the Qin dynasty was born, and with it, the first centralized imperial state in Chinese history. This moment was unprecedented. For the first time, the many warring kingdoms, regional dialects, and conflicting legal systems of the Chinese world were brought under the rule of one emperor. But the Qin unification was not just a military achievement. It represented a complete restructuring of Chinese political life, economy, law, and culture. In fewer than 15 years, Qin Shi Huang would transform the legacy of the warring states into the foundations of empire through decisive governance, sweeping reforms, and often relentless force. Qin's conquest of its rivals was methodical and calculated. By the late 3rd century before the Common Era, Qin had already become the most powerful of the remaining states. It possessed a disciplined army, efficient administration, and aggressive leadership. After eliminating the states of Han, Zhao, Yan, Wei, Chu, and finally Qi, King Zheng faced no remaining challengers. His consolidation of power was not only territorial, it was ideological. Upon assuming the title of First Emperor, Qin Shi Huang sought to eliminate all traces of feudalism and local autonomy. The old Zhou model of regional aristocrats ruling hereditary lands was abolished. In its place, Qin established a highly centralized bureaucracy, with provinces and districts governed by officials appointed directly by the emperor. These officials were selected not based on noble birth, but on demonstrated loyalty and competence. This administrative structure, with its clear hierarchy and defined responsibilities, allowed the emperor to maintain tight control over a vast and diverse territory. One of the most lasting legacies of the Qin dynasty was its program of standardization. To unify the empire, Qin Shi Huang mandated a single script for writing based on the clerical style used in Qin documents. Although regional dialects and accents remained, the written language became uniform across the empire, enabling consistent communication, record-keeping, and governance. This standardization of script would remain in place long after the Qin dynasty fell. In addition to writing, the Qin government standardized weights and measures, coinage, and even the width of cart axles. This seemingly minor detail ensured that carts could travel smoothly on the same rutted roads throughout the empire, facilitating trade and movement of troops. These reforms helped bind the empire together economically and logistically. reducing friction between regions and strengthening imperial authority. Qin Shi Huang also undertook a massive infrastructure campaign. One of the most ambitious projects was the construction of a network of roads and canals connecting all corners of the empire. These roads, known as the Straight Roads, radiated from the capital at Xianyang, allowing for rapid communication and military deployment. It is estimated that thousands of miles of roads were built during this period, all under centralized planning and labor. But perhaps the most iconic of Qin's architectural legacies was the initial construction of what would become the Great Wall. Contrary to popular belief, the Great Wall did not originate in a single continuous project. Instead, Qin Shi Huang ordered the linking and extension of existing walls built by northern states to defend against nomadic incursions, particularly from the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of steppe peoples. The emperor conscripted hundreds of thousands of laborers, many of them convicts or conscripted peasants, to carry out this massive task. Though the wall we see today is largely the result of later dynasties, the Qin laid its early foundation. To control thought and suppress dissent, the Qin court, under the influence of legalist advisors such as Li Si, initiated harsh ideological measures. In what became one of the most infamous acts of the dynasty, Qin Shi Huang ordered the burning of books that promoted philosophies contrary to legalism, particularly Confucianism and Daoism. In addition, according to some historical sources, scholars who defied the regime or criticized its policies were executed or buried alive. These actions reflected the Qin view of governance. Order must be imposed from above, through clear laws and severe punishments. Legalist thought dominated the Qin court, rejecting the softer moral persuasion of Confucian teachings. Laws were publicly posted, uniformly applied, and harshly enforced. Rewards were given for loyalty, while even minor infractions could result in severe penalties. This system created short-term efficiency, but long-term resentment. The emperor himself was an object of intense reverence and control. Qin Shi Huang adopted a semi-divine status, referring to himself not as a king, but as an emperor with a cosmic mandate. His court adopted elaborate rituals and strict protocols. Commoners and officials alike were forbidden from approaching him casually. His image was projected as a supreme ruler whose will was absolute. Despite his authoritarian methods, Qin Shi Huang was not simply a tyrant obsessed with control. He saw himself as a builder of a lasting order, and he devoted great energy to creating a stable empire. However, his rule was also marked by paranoia, particularly regarding death and succession. Late in his reign, he undertook multiple tours across the empire, consulting alchemists and mystics in search of elixirs of immortality. These efforts reflected both a fear of mortality and an ambition to reign forever. One of the most extraordinary reflections of this ambition is his tomb complex, constructed near modern-day Xi'an. Discovered in the 20th century, the tomb is famous for the terracotta army, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, horses, and chariots buried to guard the emperor in the afterlife. Each figure is unique, with individualized features and uniforms. The scale and detail of the complex demonstrate both the resources Qin could command and the emperor's desire for eternal power. Despite these grand achievements, the Qin dynasty was short-lived. The system that Qin Shi Huang built depended heavily on his personal authority, and when he died in 210 before the Common Era, the cracks began to show. His successor, Qin Shi, lacked the political skill and legitimacy of his father. Palace intrigue, heavy taxation, forced labor, and widespread unrest soon triggered rebellions across the empire. The same centralization that made the Qin efficient also made it vulnerable. Without regional leaders with vested power, the system could not easily absorb or negotiate dissent. By 206 before the Common Era, only 4 years after Qin Shi Huang's death, the dynasty collapsed under the weight of rebellion, giving way to the Han. The Qin dynasty, despite its unprecedented accomplishments in unification and statecraft, lasted only a brief span of time. After the death of its founder, Qin Shi Huang, in 210 before the Common Era, the empire he forged collapsed in fewer than 4 years. Yet, from this collapse emerged a new dynasty, the Han, that would go on to shape Chinese civilization for the next 4 centuries. This was a time of profound political turbulence. The death of Qin Shi Huang, whose centralized rule depended heavily on his personal authority, created an immediate vacuum. Instead of a smooth transfer of power, the imperial court was plunged into intrigue. The emperor's eldest son, who had been designated heir, was forced to commit suicide in a palace coup orchestrated by 2 powerful figures, the eunuch Zhou Gao and the chief minister Li Si. In his place, a younger and more pliable son was installed as Qin Shi, the second emperor. Qin Shi, inexperienced and largely controlled by Zhou Gao, failed to command the respect of officials and the loyalty of the people. The harsh legalist policies that had once created order now bred resentment. Forced labor, heavy taxation, and the suppression of dissent had exhausted the population. With the emperor perceived as weak and the court racked by corruption, rebellions broke out across the empire. One of the earliest and most significant uprisings was led by Shang and Wu Guang, 2 minor military officers. According to historical accounts, they had been ordered to lead a group of soldiers to a distant outpost. Delayed by floods and fearing execution for tardiness under Qin law, they instead chose to rebel. Though their uprising was quickly suppressed, it revealed how fragile the Qin state had become, and it inspired other, more powerful rebellions. Among the many warlords and former generals who rose during this time, 2 figures would come to dominate the struggle for power. Xiang Yu, a nobleman and military commander from the former state of Chu, and Liu Bang, a former peasant and low-ranking Qin official who would become the founder of the Han Dynasty. Xiang Yu was a bold and charismatic leader, known for his battlefield prowess and his loyalty to the legacy of Chu. He quickly became a symbol of resistance against the Qin. His forces captured the Qin capital of Shenyang in 206 before the Common Era. In a symbolic act of vengeance, Xiang Yu reportedly destroyed the palace and executed the last Qin emperor, bringing the dynasty to a definitive end. Liu Bang, in contrast, was pragmatic and politically shrewd. He entered the rebellion with far fewer resources and less noble lineage than Xiang Yu, but he gained support through leniency and strategic alliances. While Xiang Yu was feared and respected, Liu Bang was liked and trusted by many former Qin officials and common people. This difference in leadership style would prove decisive. Initially, Xiang Yu held the upper hand. After the fall of Qin, he attempted to divide the former empire into a patchwork of regional kingdoms under the control of his allies, a return to a loosely feudal structure reminiscent of earlier times. He declared himself the hegemon king of Western Chu and gave Liu Bang control over the relatively poor and remote territory of Hanzhong. However, Liu Bang was not content with a subordinate role. Over the next few years, he consolidated his power, built alliances, and moved against Xiang Yu. What followed was a drawn-out civil war known as the Chu-Han contention, which lasted from 206 to 202 before the Common Era. The conflict was not only a military struggle, but also a clash of political visions between the aristocratic militarism of Xiang Yu and the emerging bureaucratic model of Liu Bang. Liu Bang's strategy combined military resilience with diplomatic skill. He secured the support of key generals and former Qin administrators, presenting himself as a unifier rather than a destroyer. Meanwhile, Xiang Yu's brutal treatment of rivals and failure to consolidate governance weakened his position. As the war dragged on, public support increasingly shifted toward Liu Bang. The decisive moment came in 202 before the Common Era at the Battle of Gaixia, where Liu Bang's forces encircled Xiang Yu. Legend holds that Liu Bang's general, Han Xin, ordered his troops to sing Chu folk songs to demoralize Xiang Yu's army, making them believe that their homeland had already fallen. Surrounded and despondent, Xiang Yu attempted to flee but ultimately took his own life near the Wu River. With Xiang Yu gone, Liu Bang emerged as the uncontested leader of the realm. He declared the establishment of the Han Dynasty and took the title Emperor Gaozu of Han. In contrast to the Qin, whose reign had been short and rigid, Liu Bang sought a more moderate and adaptable approach. He retained the centralized structure and many administrative innovations of the Qin, but relaxed the harsh legalist policies. This synthesis of Qin order and Confucian ideals would become a hallmark of Han governance. One of Liu Bang's most important decisions was to restore stability through conciliation, not revenge. He reappointed many capable officials from the Qin era, avoided wide-scale purges, and reduced taxes. He abolished some of the more oppressive corvée labor systems and took steps to re-establish local governance. In doing so, he gained the trust of both the elite and the common people. Despite his humble origins, Liu Bang understood the value of ideological legitimacy. While he had little formal education, he surrounded himself with scholars and advisors who helped shape the narrative of the Han as a moral and benevolent dynasty. Unlike Qin Shi Huang, who claimed authority through conquest and legalist control, Liu Bang emphasized heaven's favor and the will of the people. In this way, the Han dynasty positioned itself not only as a political successor to the Qin, but as a moral corrective. The rise of the Han also marked a return to dynastic cycles based on virtue and legitimacy, rather than brute power alone. The Confucian concept of ethical rulership would gain new prominence, though it would take several decades to become fully institutionalized. The transition from Qin to Han was more than a change in dynasty. It represented a shift in the way Chinese emperors would conceive of their rule. The Qin had demonstrated that a unified empire was possible. The Han would show that such an empire could be made enduring through balance, adaptability, and a deeper connection to the values of its people. Rather than breaking from the past, the Han inherited the foundations laid by Qin and transformed them into a system capable of longevity. Where Qin's authority had been sharp and rigid, Han governance began to blend discipline with flexibility, creating space for both imperial strength and the flourishing of culture. It is against this backdrop that the early Han emperors emerged, not as mere successors to Qin's experiment, but as architects of a new imperial vision. Their story is one of consolidation and expansion, a careful weaving together of power, philosophy, and diplomacy that would shape the course of Chinese history for centuries to come. With the rise of the Han dynasty under Emperor Gaozu, formerly Liu Bang, China entered a period of political restoration and strategic consolidation. The decades following the collapse of the Qin dynasty had been marked by chaos, but under the early Han rulers, the Chinese empire regained its footing and began to flourish. What emerged during this time was not simply a stronger state, but a far more enduring model of governance, ideology, and imperial identity. The Han dynasty would last, with an interregnum, for over 4 centuries. During its early phase, often referred to as the Western Han, the dynasty laid the foundations of a centralized imperial order that blended Qin administrative rigor with Confucian moral philosophy. In doing so, it established patterns of rule that would influence every subsequent Chinese dynasty. Upon assuming the throne, Emperor Gaozu of Han faced the immediate challenge of securing legitimacy. Though victorious over Shang, he inherited a realm still reeling from civil war and burdened by the oppressive legacy of Qin centralization. Recognizing this, Emperor Gaozu adopted a pragmatic approach. He maintained the Qin bureaucratic framework, but tempered its harshness. He reduced taxes, lessened forced labor obligations, and allowed some degree of semi-autonomous rule in frontier regions, particularly among allied nobles and former generals. This semi-feudal arrangement, however, brought its own risks. Over time, the independent kingdoms began to grow stronger and more ambitious. Emperor Gaozu's successors recognized this threat. His widow, Empress Lu Ji, wielded considerable power as regent after his death and used her position to maneuver court politics and consolidate control. Although her influence is remembered with a mix of admiration and suspicion, she helped maintain stability during a delicate transition of power. True consolidation of Han authority accelerated under Emperor Wen and Emperor Jing, who continued reducing the privileges of semi-independent regional kings. In a key episode known as the Rebellion of the Seven States, Several of these kingdoms rose in opposition to imperial attempts to curtail their autonomy. The rebellion was decisively crushed, and in its aftermath, the central government asserted greater control over the provinces. From that point forward, the Han emperors ruled a more unified and tightly managed empire. While the early Han rulers focused on internal stability, it was under Emperor Wu of Han, who reigned from 141 to 87 before the Common Era, that the dynasty reached new heights of power, expansion, and sophistication. Often considered one of China's greatest emperors, Emperor Wu transformed the Han state from a regional power into a continental empire. Emperor Wu launched military campaigns on multiple fronts. In the north and northwest, he targeted the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic tribes who had long posed a threat to Chinese borderlands. Earlier Han rulers had relied on diplomacy and tribute to manage this threat, but Emperor Wu favored military solutions. He commissioned capable generals such as Wei Qing and Huo Kubing, who led massive expeditions deep into steppe territory. Although the Xiongnu were never fully subdued, Han victories weakened their influence and secured strategic trade routes. To the south, Han forces expanded into modern-day Yunnan, Guangdong, and northern Vietnam. To the west, military expeditions crossed deserts and mountains to establish contact with distant kingdoms in Central Asia. This outreach led to one of Emperor Wu's most consequential decisions, dispatching an envoy named Zhang Qian to explore potential alliances and trade opportunities. Zhang Qian's mission took him across the Tarim Basin and into the lands of the Yuezhi and other Central Asian groups. Though he was captured and detained for many years, Zhang Qian eventually returned to China with valuable knowledge about the Western regions, their geography, products, and peoples. His journey opened the door for a network of trade routes that would become known as the Silk Road. The Silk Road was not a single path, but a web of interconnected routes stretching from the Han capital Chang'an through Central Asia and into Persia, India, and eventually the Roman world. Chinese goods, especially silk, ceramics, and lacquerware, were traded for horses, glassware, precious metals, and exotic products. While trade brought wealth, it also facilitated cultural exchange. Ideas, religions, technologies, and artistic influences flowed in both directions, planting the seeds for future global interactions. Back at home, Emperor Wu embarked on another critical reform: the formal adoption of Confucianism as the ideological foundation of the state. Until this time, the Han court had incorporated various traditions, including legalism and Daoism. But under the guidance of scholars such as Dong Zhongshu, Confucian thought was elevated to official orthodoxy. Dong Zhongshu argued that the emperor was the son of heaven, a moral figure whose authority rested on virtue and cosmic harmony. He developed a theory linking human society to the natural order, where heavenly signs, such as eclipses or floods, were seen as expressions of the emperor's virtue or failure. This cosmological Confucianism reinforced the importance of ethical governance, ritual observance, and social hierarchy. To promote Confucian values, the state established an imperial academy to train future officials. There, students studied the 5 classics, texts traditionally attributed to Confucius or his followers, including the Book of Songs, the Book of History, and the Book of Rites. A new system of civil examinations began to emerge, favoring men of learning over hereditary nobles. Though still limited in scope during the Western Han, this merit-based approach would grow in significance in later dynasties. Confucianism's rise also reshaped the social fabric. The ideal official was no longer a warrior or a nobleman, but a scholar-gentleman, someone who cultivated virtue, quoted the classics, and advised the ruler with moral clarity. This shift elevated education as a path to social mobility and embedded Confucian ethics into family life, governance, and law. Under Emperor Wu, the Han dynasty also became more interventionist in economic affairs. The government established state monopolies on key industries such as salt, iron, and alcohol, partly to control prices and partly to generate revenue for military campaigns. Although some scholars criticized these policies as interfering with private enterprise, they provided the state with the resources necessary to sustain a growing empire. Despite the glory of his reign, Emperor Wu's later years were marked by financial strain, court intrigue, and social discontent. Heavy taxation and conscription burdened the population, while large landowners accumulated wealth and power, undermining the emperor's authority in rural areas. Toward the end of his life, Emperor Wu attempted to curb these problems with reform, but many of the deeper structural issues remained unresolved. After his death, the Han Dynasty entered a more cautious phase. His successors reversed some of his centralizing policies and sought to stabilize the regime through moderation. Nonetheless, the basic architecture of the Han imperial state, its institutions, ideology, and territorial vision, remained in place. The early Han period, particularly under Emperor Wu, marked a golden age of consolidation. It was a time when the Chinese state redefined its identity, not just as a collection of provinces or a military machine, but as a civilization with a unified culture, shared values, and a sense of mission. Through Confucianism, expansion, and strategic governance, the Han Dynasty positioned itself as the rightful heir to the ancient Zhou ideals while mastering the instruments of modern empire. This balance of tradition and innovation gave the Han a remarkable durability, but no dynasty is free from strain. Beneath the surface of cultural brilliance and political order, tensions were mounting, economic disparities widened, aristocratic power hardened, and ideological debates sharpened. It was within this atmosphere of both grandeur and fragility that a singular figure stepped forward. Wang Mang, celebrated by some as a Confucian reformer and denounced by others as a usurper, sought not merely to preserve the Han inheritance, but to refashion it altogether. His rise and fall would interrupt the Han order in dramatic fashion, leaving behind one of the most revealing episodes in China's imperial saga. As the Western Han Dynasty moved into its final decades, the strength of imperial governance began to erode. Land inequality was rising, court factions were battling for influence, and regional elites were growing more autonomous. Within this climate of discontent, a remarkable but controversial figure emerged: Wang Mang. A Confucian scholar and politician, Wang Mang attempted to halt the decline of the Han by radically reshaping Chinese society. His short-lived reign, from 9 to 23 of the Common Era, is one of the most debated episodes in Chinese history, a bold experiment in moral reform, state control, and social engineering. Wang Mang was not born into the direct imperial line. He was a member of the powerful Wang clan, which had grown dominant during the later Western Han period through strategic marriages into the ruling family. His aunt, Empress Wang Zhengjun, was the widow of Emperor Yuan and the Empress Dowager during the reigns of successive emperors. This placed Wang Mang in a prime position to rise within the court. Unlike many aristocrats of his time, Wang Mang cultivated an image of austerity, integrity, and devotion to Confucian values. He portrayed himself as a model of classical virtue, respectful to elders, modest in dress, and studious in the ancient texts. His behavior stood in stark contrast to the corruption and luxury that had come to characterize the court. This won him admiration from Confucian scholars and the general public, who were disillusioned with the moral decline of the ruling elite. Wang Mang first served as regent for the young Emperor Ping, but when the emperor died under suspicious circumstances, Wang Mang declared that the mandate of heaven had passed to him. In the year 9 of the Common Era, he proclaimed the beginning of a new dynasty, the Xin, meaning new, and took the title of emperor. With this act, Wang Mang ended centuries of Han rule, though he claimed to be restoring the ancient ideals of the Zhou. The Xin dynasty was founded on the promise of renewal. Wang Mang's reforms were deeply inspired by Confucian classics, especially those that described the supposedly harmonious society of early Zhou times. He believed that by returning to these moral and social ideals, he could solve the empire's problems and restore balance between the ruler and the people. Among his most ambitious reforms was a program of land redistribution. Wang Mang sought to limit the amount of land that wealthy families could own and to redistribute excess land to peasants. He abolished the buying and selling of land and ordered that it be treated as state property to be allocated more equally. This policy was known as the well-field system, a revival of an ancient land division model believed to have existed under the Zhou. In addition to land reform, Wang Mang attempted to nationalize key industries, including salt, iron, and liquor production. He introduced new currencies to stabilize the economy and tried to regulate prices through state granaries. He also redefined social hierarchies, creating new titles and ranks based on moral criteria rather than inheritance or wealth. While his intentions may have aligned with Confucian ideals, the execution of Wang Mang's reforms encountered serious difficulties. The land reforms faced strong resistance from the powerful landowning class, many of whom simply ignored the new laws or bribed officials to maintain their holdings. The currency reforms caused confusion in markets, and counterfeit coins further destabilized the economy. Price controls and national monopolies disrupted trade rather than improving it. Bureaucratic capacity was not sufficient to enforce such wide-ranging policies effectively. Moreover, Wang Mang's attempts to control society extended into personal matters. He introduced laws regulating clothing, marriage customs, and naming practices, further alienating segments of the population. The pace and scope of his reforms overwhelmed the administrative system and generated growing unrest. While internal dissatisfaction grew, natural disasters compounded the crisis. The Yellow River changed its course during Wang Mang's reign, flooding vast areas of farmland and displacing hundreds of thousands of people. Famine spread across northern China, and government relief efforts failed to meet the scale of the disaster. As in earlier dynastic cycles, these natural calamities were interpreted as signs that heaven had withdrawn its mandate. In the midst of social and environmental collapse, local rebellions began to erupt. One of the most significant was led by a group known as the Red Eyebrows, named for the distinctive markings worn by their members. Composed largely of desperate peasants and disaffected soldiers, they opposed the Qin regime and called for the restoration of the Han Dynasty. Other rebel leaders, including former Han loyalists and regional military commanders, also began to mobilize. Wang Mang's inability to effectively respond to these uprisings further weakened his hold on power. His army suffered a major defeat in the east, and rebel forces began converging on the capital, Chang'an. In the year 23 of the Common Era, Wang Mang made a final stand in the imperial palace. According to historical sources, he fought bravely, reportedly arming himself with a ceremonial jade scepter when no other weapons were available. He was killed as rebels stormed the palace, and the Qin dynasty came to an abrupt and violent end. Although Wang Mang's reign was short and ultimately unsuccessful, its significance is far greater than its duration. His efforts reflect the enduring tension in Chinese history between idealism and practicality, between the dream of restoring moral order and the realities of political power. Wang Mang was a visionary who sought to legislate virtue and justice, but his inability to manage the resistance of entrenched elites, the limitations of state capacity, and the unpredictable forces of nature doomed his reforms. In the years that followed his death, Han loyalists re-established the dynasty, beginning the Eastern Han period. The restoration was framed as a return to rightful order, but the memory of Wang Mang's reforms lingered. Later, Confucian scholars debated whether he was a tyrant or a tragic idealist. Some admired his ambition, others condemned his overreach. The Qin interregnum also highlighted the fragility of centralized authority. Without broad support and effective enforcement, even the most well-intentioned policies could backfire. Future dynasties would remember the lesson. Reforms must be gradual, strategic, and balanced between ideology and administrative capacity. The collapse of Wang Mang's vision left the empire scarred, but also revealed the resilience of the Han legacy. Out of the turbulence emerged an opportunity not merely to restore the dynasty, but to redefine its structures of power for a new era. What followed was the Eastern Han, a dynasty that rose on the promise of renewal, but gradually found itself entangled in new patterns of corruption, factionalism, and social unrest. If the Western Han had symbolized the confident expansion of imperial China, the Eastern Han would come to embody the challenges of maintaining unity under the weight of entrenched interests and mounting pressures from within. After the violent fall of Wang Meng and the collapse of the Qin dynasty in the year 23 of the Common Era, China once again found itself fragmented and uncertain. Amid this chaos, forces loyal to the Han gathered in support of a distant member of the imperial family named Liu Shu. With a combination of military skill, political acumen, and strategic alliances, Liu Shu defeated rival claimants and re-established the Han dynasty in the year 25. He ascended the throne as Emperor Guangwu, founding what is known historically as the Eastern Han dynasty, also referred to as the Later Han. The Eastern Han marked the restoration of imperial continuity, but it was not a simple return to the glory of earlier times. While Emperor Guangwu and his early successors rebuilt many of the institutions that had weakened under the Qin, the dynasty soon began to face a new set of internal challenges that would eventually lead to its unraveling. One of Emperor Guangwu's most notable achievements was his ability to consolidate power quickly and stabilize the empire. He re-established the capital in Luoyang, east of the former Han capital of Chang'an, symbolizing a new phase in dynastic life. Guangwu adopted a conciliatory approach, granting amnesty to former enemies, restoring Confucian rituals, and scaling back some of the more aggressive legal and economic policies imposed during the Western Han and Qin periods. In the decades that followed, the Eastern Han court restored state control over outlying regions, reasserted military presence in the northwest, and resumed diplomatic and commercial relations along the Silk Road. Trade continued with Central Asia, and even with the Roman Empire, known in Chinese sources as Daqin. Chinese goods such as silk, lacquerware, and ceramics remained highly prized across Asia. Yet beneath the surface of imperial revival, deeper structural problems persisted. As time passed, the central authority of the Han emperors weakened. Wealthy landowners continued to accumulate large estates, often at the expense of small farmers who were forced to sell their land during times of hardship. These local magnates, backed by private militias and connected to court officials, began to act as rulers in all but name, collecting taxes, dispensing justice, and defying imperial directives. One of the most damaging long-term developments during the Eastern Han was the growing influence of eunuchs at court. Eunuchs, castrated men who served in the inner palace, had long existed in Chinese dynastic life, often entrusted with sensitive tasks due to their inability to establish family dynasties. Over time, however, their proximity to the emperor allowed them to gain political influence, particularly when young or weak emperors ascended the throne. By the middle of the 2nd century, eunuchs had begun to dominate court politics. Many emperors, suspicious of the aristocratic bureaucracy, relied on eunuchs for advice and personal loyalty. The eunuchs, in turn, used their position to enrich themselves and install allies in key posts. Their unchecked power created deep resentment among Confucian-trained scholars and officials, who viewed them as unworthy usurpers of political authority. The resulting rivalry between eunuch factions and the Confucian literati destabilized the court. Efforts by upright officials to curb eunuch power were often met with purges. One of the most infamous episodes was the Disasters of Partisan Prohibitions, a series of crackdowns in which hundreds of Confucian scholars were arrested, dismissed, or executed for criticizing the government. This persecution silenced many voices of reform and undermined the integrity of civil administration. While elite conflict paralyzed the capital, conditions in the countryside continued to deteriorate. High taxes, forced labor, and natural disasters, especially devastating floods of the Yellow River, created widespread misery among the peasantry. Famine and displacement became common, while corruption among local officials eroded trust in the state. These tensions eventually gave rise to large-scale rebellion. In the year 184 of the Common Era, a religious political movement known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted across northern China. Led by Zhang, a healer and mystic who preached a form of Taoist-inspired salvation, the movement promised a utopian age of equality and peace. Wearing yellow cloths as a symbol of their cause, the rebels declared that the Han had lost the mandate of heaven and must be overthrown. The Yellow Turban Rebellion quickly spread across multiple provinces, involving hundreds of thousands of followers. Although it was eventually crushed by imperial forces and regional warlords, the uprising permanently damaged the legitimacy of the Han court. It revealed just how fragile the state had become and exposed the depth of rural discontent. In response to the rebellion, the court increasingly relied on regional military commanders to restore order. These warlords, often drawn from aristocratic families or former Han generals, were granted emergency powers to recruit troops and administer territories. In the short term, they helped suppress rebellions and secure the borders. In the long term, they became powerful, semi-independent rulers in their own right. By the late 2nd century, the Eastern Han court had lost control over much of its empire. The capital became the stage for bloody power struggles among eunuchs, warlords, and imperial relatives. The young emperors who succeeded each other were often manipulated or killed. In one notorious incident, a coalition of warlords led by He Jin, the emperor's brother-in-law, attempted to purge the eunuchs, only to be betrayed and assassinated. The resulting chaos allowed military leaders such as Dong Zhuo to seize control of the court by force. Dong Zhuo's brief dictatorship and brutal tactics further destabilized the empire. In response, regional leaders began raising armies against him, forming shifting alliances and fighting for supremacy. The resulting conflicts marked the beginning of the empire's final fragmentation. By the early 3rd century, the Han emperor had become a puppet, manipulated by rival generals who ruled in his name. The once mighty dynasty, which had unified China and overseen centuries of cultural and technological development, now existed in name only. The stage was set for full imperial collapse and a return to political disunity. Despite its decline, the Eastern Han period also witnessed important intellectual and technological achievements. Scholars compiled and annotated classical texts, preserving Confucian doctrine for future generations. Advances were made in medicine, astronomy, and engineering. The invention of paper, traditionally attributed to the court eunuch Kai Lun, revolutionized record-keeping and literature. Buddhist texts from India began to enter China, carried by monks and merchants along the Silk Road, planting the early seeds of a new spiritual tradition. The legacy of the Eastern Han is complex. It was a time of institutional decay and court intrigue, but also of cultural resilience and transition. The tensions between eunuchs and scholars, between court and countryside, and between center and periphery would reappear in later dynasties. The idea of a moral Confucian state governed by virtue remained powerful, even as reality fell short of the ideal. The formal end of the Eastern Han dynasty in the year 220 of the Common Era did not bring peace to China. Instead, it marked the beginning of one of the most turbulent and storied periods in Chinese history, the era of the Three Kingdoms. Though short in duration, lasting roughly 6 decades, this period became one of the most influential in Chinese cultural memory, thanks in part to its vivid personalities, dramatic conflicts, and enduring legacy in literature and folklore. Historically, the Three Kingdoms period refers to the division of China into 3 rival states, Wei, Shu, and Wu. Each claimed to be the legitimate heir of the Han dynasty. Each was governed by a powerful leader with grand ambitions, and each engaged in shifting alliances, brutal warfare, and diplomatic intrigue in a bid to unify the empire under its own rule. The root of this tripartite division lay in the final decades of Han decline. As the central court lost control, powerful regional warlords emerged, carving out their own territories and armies. Among them, 3 men would come to dominate the political landscape: Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Sun Quan. Cao Cao, the most formidable of the 3, was a brilliant military strategist and pragmatic administrator. Though officially serving as the chancellor to the last Han emperor, he held the real power in the north. After defeating rivals and pacifying much of northern China, he established a stable government based in Ye, implementing agricultural reforms, securing supply lines, and recruiting talented advisors such as Xun Yu, Sima Yi, and Guojia. While Cao Cao never declared himself emperor, his control over the imperial court allowed him to rule with near-absolute authority. After Cao Cao's death, his son Cao Pi forced the abdication of the last Han emperor in the year 220 and declared himself the first emperor of the state of Wei, thereby ending the Han dynasty and ushering in a new era of open rivalry among the major powers. To the southwest, Liu Bei emerged as the leader of the state of Shuhan, headquartered in Chengdu. A distant relative of the Han imperial family, Liu Bei portrayed himself as the legitimate successor to Han rule. Unlike Cao Cao's image as a calculating realist, Liu Bei cultivated a reputation for righteousness, loyalty, and Confucian virtue. His close bond with his sworn brothers, the fierce general Zhang Fei and the mighty warrior Guan Yu, became legendary through later storytelling. His court was further strengthened by the presence of the brilliant strategist Zhuge Liang, whose foresight and resourcefulness earned him lasting fame. The third major power, Wu, was based in the southeast along the Yangtze River and led by the charismatic and pragmatic Sun Quan. He inherited the leadership of the region from his older brother Sun Si, who had died young. Sun Quan proved to be a skilled ruler, balancing military strength with economic development. The Wu state maintained a strong navy and used the natural defenses of the Yangtze to resist northern invasions. Wu was unique in its strong maritime connections and its relative political stability compared to its rivals. One of the defining events of the Three Kingdoms period was the Battle of Red Cliffs, fought around the winter of the year 208. This decisive engagement pitted the northern forces of Cao Cao against the allied armies of Liu Bei and Sun Quan. Cao Cao, fresh from victories in the north, sought to extend his control into the south by sailing a vast fleet down the Yangtze River. However, his forces, unfamiliar with naval warfare and plagued by disease, were decisively defeated by the Southern Alliance through a combination of fire attacks, deception, and superior naval tactics. The victory at Red Cliffs prevented Cao Cao from unifying China and cemented the power of the southern states. After the battle, Liu Bei secured the region of Yizhou, forming the foundation of the Shu state, while Sun Quan consolidated his rule in the southeast. Though united temporarily in war, the alliance between Liu Bei and Sun Quan would later collapse, turning former allies into bitter rivals. Despite the scale of warfare, the Three Kingdoms period was also marked by cultural and intellectual vitality. Military strategy, governance, and diplomacy were refined to new levels. The writings of advisors and officials were collected into texts that would influence later generations. Strategic doctrines such as those recorded in Zhuge Liang's memorials and Sima Yi's campaigns reflected a new depth in statecraft and leadership. However, the constant warfare came at a heavy cost. The population declined significantly due to battle, famine, and displacement. Agricultural production was disrupted, and large areas of land were abandoned. Social mobility diminished as warlords entrenched hereditary military elites. Though courts continued to uphold Confucian ideals, the realities of power during this period often belonged to those with military strength and political cunning. One of the most remarkable features of the Three Kingdoms era is how deeply it became embedded in Chinese cultural consciousness. Centuries after the fall of the Three Kingdoms, the historical events were romanticized and dramatized in the 14th century novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms by Luo Guanzhong. This literary work, blending history and legend, immortalized the exploits of figures like Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhuge Liang. It portrayed themes of loyalty, betrayal, brotherhood, and the struggle for justice, resonating deeply with readers and becoming one of the most beloved novels in Chinese literature. Although fictionalized in many respects, Romance of the Three Kingdoms helped shape how generations of Chinese people understood this period. Its stories influenced drama, opera, poetry, and even modern media. As a result, the Three Kingdoms era came to symbolize both the tragic cost of division and the enduring virtues of heroism and loyalty. In reality, the period ended not through a grand unification, but through slow attrition. The state of Shu fell first, conquered by the Wei general Deng Ai in the year 263. Wu followed, subdued by Wei's successor state in the year 280. Wei itself had already begun to weaken internally. The powerful general Sima Zhou, son of Cao Cao's advisor Sima Yi, consolidated power behind the scenes. His son, Sima Yan, eventually forced the abdication of the last Wei emperor and founded the Jin dynasty in the year 265. Thus, the period of the Three Kingdoms came to a close, and China was once again nominally unified, this time under the Jin. But the Jin dynasty would inherit a fragile and war-weary land. The ideals of empire persisted, but the divisions and lessons of the Three Kingdoms would linger for centuries. The fall of the Three Kingdoms and the brief reunification under the Jin dynasty in the late 3rd century of the Common Era marked a significant, if fragile, moment in Chinese history. For the first time in nearly a century, the empire was again under a single rule. However, this reunification proved temporary. What followed was a long and complex period of fragmentation, cultural diversification, and political experimentation that historians refer to as the Era of Division, stretching across the Western and Eastern Jin dynasties and the subsequent Northern and Southern dynasties period. The Jin dynasty was founded by Sima Yan, the son of the powerful general Sima Zhou, who had seized control of the state of Wei in the final years of the Three Kingdoms. In the year 265, Sima Yan declared the establishment of the Western Jin dynasty and adopted the title Emperor Wu of Jin. 15 years later, in 280, Jin forces conquered the state of Wu, completing the unification of China. Despite this success, the new dynasty was built on unstable foundations. The central government struggled to control the vast regional aristocracy that had emerged during the preceding century of warfare. Many of the powerful families who had served the Wei, Shu, or Wu regimes retained their military power and economic base, creating a decentralized structure vulnerable to internal conflict. One of the most damaging episodes in Jin history was the War of the Eight Princes, a civil conflict among members of the Sima family that erupted shortly after Emperor Wu's death. Over a period of years, various princes fought for control of the imperial court, drawing in armies, destabilizing provinces, and devastating the countryside. This infighting weakened the state and left it exposed to external threats. The greatest of these threats came from the nomadic peoples of the north, particularly the Xiongnu, Xianbei, Ji, and Shang. As Jin authority weakened, these groups began to move into Chinese territory, establishing their own kingdoms and challenging Jin rule. In the early 4th century, a series of uprisings and invasions led to the catastrophic fall of Luoyang and later Chang'an, the twin capitals of the Western Jin. The emperor was captured and executed. Northern China descended into chaos. This collapse marked the end of the Western Jin and the beginning of what is known as the 16 Kingdoms period in the north, a time during which a series of short-lived, ethnically diverse regimes ruled parts of northern China. Many of these states were founded by leaders of non-Han origin, including Xiongnu, Xianbei, and other steppe or borderland peoples. While some regimes were unstable and violent, others adopted elements of Chinese governance, Confucian ideals, and Buddhism, blending nomadic and sedentary traditions in new and lasting ways. Meanwhile, remnants of the Jin court fled south across the Yangtze River. In the year 317, the Eastern Jin dynasty was established with its capital at Jiangkang, present-day Nanjing. Although weaker in military terms than its northern predecessors, the Eastern Jin preserved many aspects of Han culture, administrative structure, and elite Confucian scholarship. The South became a refuge for displaced northern aristocrats and intellectuals, contributing to a cultural flourishing despite political instability. The Eastern Jin era was marked by both resilience and tension. On the one hand, the regime succeeded in repelling repeated northern invasions, often through a combination of diplomacy and military campaigns. Generals such as Huan Wen and Liu Yu played key roles in preserving southern autonomy. On the other hand, the court remained factionalized, and real power often lay with military commanders rather than the emperor. In the early 5th century, General Liu Yu seized control of the government and declared the founding of the Liu Song dynasty, marking the beginning of the Southern Dynasties era. Over the next century, southern China would be ruled by a succession of short-lived dynasties: Liu Song, Southern Qi, Liang, and Chen. These regimes maintained continuity in many aspects of governance and culture, but were plagued by internal coups, court rivalries, and weak central authority. In the north, the fragmentation of the 16 kingdoms gradually gave way to consolidation under the Northern Wei dynasty, founded by the Tuoba clan of the Xianbei people. The Northern Wei represented a major turning point. Although founded by non-Han rulers, the dynasty undertook a deliberate process of Sinicization, adopting Chinese-style bureaucracy, Confucian rituals, and the Chinese language. The most notable reformer of this period was Emperor Xiaowen, who mandated the use of Chinese surnames, dress, and court customs among the Xianbei elite. The Northern Wei also embraced Buddhism, which had been gaining popularity across both northern and southern China. Under their patronage, monumental Buddhist cave complexes such as those at Yungang and Longmen were constructed, filled with massive statues, intricate carvings, and devotional inscriptions. These sites demonstrate the synthesis of Indian, Central Asian, and Chinese artistic traditions and the role of Buddhism as a unifying cultural force. Despite its achievements, the Northern Wei eventually split into Eastern Wei and Western Wei, setting off a new round of fragmentation. Nevertheless, the groundwork had been laid for further unification, and the northern dynasties continued to grow in military strength and administrative capacity. Throughout this entire period, known collectively as the Northern and Southern Dynasties, China remained politically divided but culturally vibrant. The North and South developed along somewhat different paths. In the North, rulers were often of non-Han origin, and their policies reflected a mix of steppe and Chinese influences. In the South, Han traditions remained dominant, but political instability hampered strong governance. Socially and culturally, however, this was an era of experimentation and transformation. Confucianism remained central in both regions, but it was increasingly challenged and complemented by Buddhism and Daoism. Buddhist monasticism grew dramatically, offering alternative structures of authority, education, and social support. Monasteries became centers of learning, art, and charity, sometimes accumulating significant wealth and political influence. The transmission and translation of Buddhist texts flourished during this period. Indian and Central Asian monks, such as Kumarajva, traveled to China and translated key scriptures into Chinese. These translations introduced new philosophical ideas, cosmologies, and practices, which would profoundly shape Chinese religious life. Meanwhile, Taoism also evolved, developing more organized institutions, cosmological theories, and ritual systems. Competing with Buddhism for imperial patronage and popular support, Taoism became more formalized, producing scriptures, temples, and priesthoods that mirrored Buddhist models. Culturally, the period witnessed the rise of literary refinement, calligraphy, and painting. The aristocratic elite, especially in the South, engaged in poetic gatherings, artistic pursuits, and philosophical discussions. This era saw the composition of major works of poetry, as well as the development of landscape painting as a distinct and celebrated form. Despite the division, the idea of a unified China persisted. The dream of restoring a single empire remained alive in the political rhetoric of both northern and southern rulers. That ideal would finally be realized in the late 6th century by a new and ambitious northern dynasty. While much of China remained politically divided during the centuries of the northern and southern dynasties, a powerful force emerged that transcended borders, reshaped thought, and redefined cultural identity. Buddhism. Introduced into China during the Han period, Buddhism flourished between the 4th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, becoming one of the most influential spiritual and intellectual movements in Chinese history. This transformation did not occur overnight. Buddhism, a religion originating in India, entered China through Central Asian trade routes. Initially regarded with curiosity or skepticism by Confucian scholars, its appeal gradually spread among different layers of society: rulers, aristocrats, monks, artisans, and ordinary people. Over time, Buddhism not only influenced religious life, but also left its imprint on politics, philosophy, art, literature, and public institutions. One of the key factors in Buddhism's expansion was the continued support of northern rulers, especially during the Northern Wei dynasty. The ruling Tuoba clan, originally of Xianbei origin, actively promoted Buddhism as a means of unifying their multi-ethnic population and legitimizing their authority. Under emperors such as Emperor Wencheng and Emperor Xiaowen, Buddhist temples, monasteries, and stupas were built across the empire. These projects often combined Indian religious symbolism with Chinese architectural forms, creating a distinctive new aesthetic. Among the most striking legacies of this period are the Buddhist cave temples, particularly those at Yungang and Longmen. Carved into cliff faces and mountainsides, these sites were monumental in scale and rich in artistic detail. The Yungang grottos, near modern Datong, were initiated in the 5th century under Northern Wei patronage. Dozens of caves house thousands of statues of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas, carved directly into the rock, ranging in size from small icons to massive seated figures towering over visitors. Later, the Longmen grottos near Luoyang continued and expanded this tradition during the transition from the Northern Wei to successor states. These caves feature more refined and synicized depictions of Buddhist deities, showing a gradual shift in iconography from Indian-influenced forms to uniquely Chinese styles. In both locations, inscriptions detail the donors, patrons, and religious intentions behind the carvings, offering insight into the spiritual life of the time. The success of Buddhism was also due to the work of translators and scholars who made Indian scriptures accessible to Chinese audiences. Chief among them was Kumarajva, a Central Asian monk who arrived in China in the late 4th century. Sponsored by rulers of the later Qin state, he led a team of translators that produced clear and elegant versions of key Mahayana texts, including the Lotus Sutra and the Diamond Sutra. His translations emphasized philosophical clarity and literary beauty, helping to win over both monastics and lay believers. Another major figure was Faxian, a Chinese monk who undertook a perilous journey to India in search of original Buddhist scriptures. Traveling on foot across deserts, mountains, and foreign lands, he reached major Buddhist centers in India and Sri Lanka before returning to China by sea. His travelogue, Record of the Buddhist Kingdoms, provided detailed accounts of monastic practices, sacred relics, and the condition of Buddhism abroad. Faxian's writings inspired future generations of pilgrims and scholars. By the 5th and 6th centuries, Chinese Buddhism had developed its own schools of thought, practices, and institutions. Monastic communities grew in size and influence. Temples served not only as places of worship, but also as centers of learning, manuscript preservation, and social welfare. Monks offered spiritual guidance, education, and medical care to the local population. Some monasteries became wealthy landowners, further integrating themselves into the regional economy. However, the rise of Buddhism was not without tension. Confucian and Taoist thinkers often criticized Buddhist practices, particularly the monastic rejection of family life and state obligations. Confucian scholars argued that the Buddhist vow of celibacy undermined filial piety and threatened social harmony. Taoists, meanwhile, saw Buddhism as a foreign import that challenged indigenous spiritual traditions. These debates, often framed in philosophical or political terms, reflected deeper questions about identity, loyalty, and cultural integration. In response to these criticisms, many Buddhist thinkers sought to reconcile their teachings with traditional Chinese values. They emphasized moral discipline, compassion, and meditation as compatible with Confucian ethics. Some developed syncretic philosophies, blending Buddhist metaphysics with Taoist cosmology. Others reinterpreted Buddhist doctrines using Confucian terminology. Over time, Chinese Buddhism became a localized tradition, distinct from its Indian roots. One of the most significant doctrinal developments during this time was the emergence of Tiantai Buddhism, which synthesized various teachings into a comprehensive system. Tiantai thinkers, such as Zhou, argued for the harmonization of all Buddhist scriptures and emphasized meditation, ethical conduct, and the Lotus Sutra as the highest teaching. Though Tiantai would not reach its full maturity until later, its foundations were laid in this formative era. Another important development was the growing popularity of Pure Land Buddhism, which focused on devotion to Amitabha Buddha and the aspiration to be reborn in his Western paradise, a realm free from suffering where enlightenment was guaranteed. Pure Land practice, centered on reciting Amitabha's name, was simple and accessible, appealing to both educated elites and common believers. It offered hope in a time of social unrest and instability, becoming one of the most widespread forms of Buddhism in China. The institutional power of Buddhism reached its peak in this period. Emperors and nobles donated land, built temples, and sponsored the copying of scriptures. Buddhist festivals, processions, and rituals became major public events, drawing large crowds and demonstrating the religion's reach. Buddhist art, from murals and sculptures to pagodas and reliquaries, flourished across the empire. Yet this growth also provoked backlash. Some officials saw monastic exemptions from taxation and military service as harmful to state finances. Others feared the accumulation of wealth and influence in monastic hands. These concerns would later lead to periodic persecutions and restrictions, though during the 4th through 6th centuries, imperial support remained generally strong. One of the most profound contributions of Buddhism during this era was its effect on Chinese views of the cosmos and the self. Concepts such as karma, rebirth, and emptiness introduced new ways of thinking about causality, ethics, and the nature of existence. Buddhist stories and parables enriched Chinese literature, while its emphasis on impermanence and compassion reshaped artistic themes and spiritual practices. The Buddhist presence also fostered international connections, linking China to India, Central Asia, Korea, and eventually Japan. Pilgrimage routes and scholarly exchanges helped create a shared religious and cultural sphere across East and South Asia. Chinese monks, translators, and travelers contributed to the broader Buddhist world, even as they adapted the tradition to fit local conditions. In this sense, the rise of Buddhism during the 4th to 6th centuries represents more than the spread of a religion. It marks a civilizational transformation, a deep engagement with new ideas, practices, and institutions that reshaped how Chinese people thought about life, death, virtue, and society. Even amid political fragmentation, Buddhism offered a sense of continuity, meaning, and aspiration. As the 6th century drew to a close, the political landscape was once again shifting. In the north, a powerful general from the northern Zhou would seize control and lay the groundwork for reunification. His son would go on to found the Sui dynasty, restoring centralized rule and setting the stage for a new golden age. After centuries of fragmentation, cultural transformation, and competing dynasties, the Chinese world was once again brought under centralized rule with the rise of the Sui dynasty in the late 6th century of the Common Era. Although the Sui would govern for less than 4 decades, its reign proved to be one of the most consequential transitional periods in Chinese history. It reunited the North and South, rebuilt the imperial bureaucracy, and launched ambitious projects that laid the groundwork for the golden age of the Tang dynasty. The founder of the Sui dynasty, Yang Jian, was a northern general of mixed Han and Xianbei heritage who served the northern Zhou dynasty. Following a power vacuum after the death of the northern Zhou ruler, Yang Jian seized the opportunity to consolidate power. In the year 581, he declared himself Emperor Wen of Sui, marking the beginning of a new dynasty. Over the next few years, he led a series of campaigns that gradually eliminated rival regimes in the south, culminating in the reunification of China by 589. The unification achieved by the Sui was more than a military triumph. It was a vision of political and administrative centralization. Emperor Wen sought to revive the ancient ideals of imperial governance, particularly drawing upon the best elements of previous dynasties. To strengthen the authority of the state and ensure effective control over a vast territory, the Sui emperors introduced significant administrative reforms. One of the most important was the creation of a three-tiered government structure, which included central, provincial, and local administrations. The central bureaucracy was reorganized into three primary departments, one to handle policy decisions, another for administrative oversight, and a third to draft and review imperial edicts. This structure allowed for greater specialization and oversight within the imperial court. In addition to bureaucratic reform, Emperor Wen revived and expanded the civil service examination system. While the system was still in its early stages and heavily reliant on recommendations, it marked a critical shift toward merit-based recruitment. Talented individuals were chosen for government service based on their knowledge of Confucian classics, history, and administrative theory. Though limited in reach, these early examinations laid the foundation for a more institutionalized and competitive bureaucracy under the Tang and later dynasties. Religious policy under the Sui was notably inclusive. Emperor Wen, himself a devout Buddhist, actively promoted Buddhism, but also supported Confucianism and Daoism. He funded the construction of temples, commissioned Buddhist texts, and used Buddhist rituals to legitimize his rule. His religious tolerance contributed to social stability and helped bridge cultural differences between the formerly divided North and South. One of the most ambitious and defining features of the Sui dynasty was its commitment to massive infrastructure projects, particularly the creation of a vast transportation network to unify the empire economically and logistically. The most famous of these was the construction of the Grand Canal, an enormous engineering feat that linked the fertile Yangtze River basin in the south with the Yellow River and the capital cities in the north. The Grand Canal allowed for the efficient movement of grain, goods, troops, and information across vast distances. It facilitated trade, reduced regional disparities, and strengthened central control over distant provinces. While earlier dynasties had constructed segments of canal networks, the Sui created a unified system on an unprecedented scale. Labor for the canal, along with other projects such as roads, fortifications, and palaces, was supplied by hundreds of thousands of conscripted workers, many of whom endured extreme conditions. These infrastructure initiatives were critical for imperial integration, but also placed an enormous burden on the population. The strain became more acute during the reign of Emperor Wen's son, Emperor Yang of Sui, who succeeded him in the early 7th century. Emperor Yang was an ambitious and energetic ruler who sought to expand the Sui legacy through grandiose projects and military conquests. However, his policies increasingly alienated the populace. Under Emperor Yang, additional palaces and capitals were constructed, including the lavish city of Luoyang, which served as a new eastern capital. His court became known for its extravagance, and public works projects continued at an exhausting pace. Meanwhile, Emperor Yang launched a series of military campaigns, most notably against the powerful Goguryeo kingdom on the Korean peninsula. These campaigns, which aimed to extend Sui influence in Northeast Asia, turned into military disasters. Despite massive mobilizations and costly expeditions, the Sui armies failed to conquer Goguryeo. The invasions resulted in staggering loss of life, financial depletion, and growing resentment among the population. Rebellions began to break out in various parts of the empire, led by disillusioned officials, local warlords, and desperate peasants. As discontent spread, the imperial court struggled to maintain order. Emperor Yang, increasingly isolated and mistrusted by his advisors, resorted to purges and harsher policies. In the year 618, he was assassinated by one of his own generals during a campaign in the south. With his death, the Sui dynasty collapsed. Despite its abrupt end, the Sui dynasty's legacy was immense. It restored the idea of a unified Chinese empire after centuries of division. It re-established central bureaucratic control, expanded the civil service, and invested in public infrastructure on a massive scale. These achievements created the institutional framework that would be inherited and perfected by the Tang dynasty. Moreover, the Sui demonstrated that unification required more than military conquest. It required systems, legal, administrative, economic, that could endure. Although the dynasty failed to maintain public support due to overextension and heavy burdens, its vision of integration was one that future dynasties would continue to pursue. The Sui also provided important lessons in governance. The balance between ambition and sustainability, between central authority and local cooperation, between infrastructure and social welfare, would become recurring themes in Chinese political history. Even the failure of the Sui's military campaigns informed future strategic thinking about the limits of power projection beyond China's borders. The fall of the Sui dynasty in the early 7th century ushered in a period of uncertainty, but it did not last long. From the political debris of Sui rule emerged one of the most celebrated dynasties in Chinese history, the Tang dynasty. Founded in the year 618 by Li Yuan, who would become Emperor Gaozu of Tang, the dynasty quickly restored stability and set the stage for an extraordinary age of prosperity, cultural achievement, and international engagement. For nearly 3 centuries, Tang China stood as a cosmopolitan empire, admired and emulated far beyond its borders. Li Yuan was a former Sui general of noble descent. During the late Sui turmoil, he joined the widespread rebellion against Emperor Yang. After seizing the capital, he declared the founding of a new dynasty and, with the help of his son Li Shimin, consolidated power across the empire. Li Shimin, a brilliant military strategist and administrator, later forced his father to abdicate and ascended the throne as Emperor Taizong, one of China's most admired rulers. Under Emperor Taizong's leadership, the Tang dynasty began to flourish. He reduced the burdens of taxation, restructured the bureaucracy, and actively recruited talent regardless of birth. He reinstated and improved the civil service examination system, ensuring that officials were selected based on merit and education rather than aristocratic privilege. This system, grounded in Confucian learning and state ideology, helped create a capable and professional governing class. One of the early Tang government's hallmark policies was the equal field system. This agrarian reform aimed to prevent land concentration by redistributing agricultural land based on household size and productivity. The land technically belonged to the state and was allocated to farmers for life, with portions returned upon death. This system supported tax collection, military conscription, and social stability, at least in the dynasty's early centuries. The Tang court also invested heavily in public infrastructure. The Grand Canal, first constructed under the Sui, was maintained and expanded, linking the economic centers of the south with the political heart of the north. Roads, postal stations, and river transport systems allowed for the swift movement of goods, information, and officials. These logistical networks tied the empire together and supported both governance and commerce. Tang military campaigns expanded Chinese control into Central Asia, Korea, and parts of modern-day Vietnam. The Yangtze Protectorate in the western regions served as an outpost for trade and defense, projecting Chinese influence into the Silk Road corridor. Tang forces clashed with the Tibetan Empire, the Turks, and other regional powers, often with mixed results. Nonetheless, these efforts made Tang China a dominant geopolitical force across East and Central Asia. Culturally, the Tang period is remembered as a golden age of Chinese civilization. The capital, Chang'an, located in present-day Xi'an, became one of the world's largest and most cosmopolitan cities. It was a planned city of grand avenues, bustling markets, palaces, temples, and residential wards. Foreign merchants, envoys, monks, and scholars arrived from as far as Persia, Arabia, India, and beyond. The city's diversity and openness reflected the Tang government's confidence and its embrace of global exchange. Art and literature thrived under the Tang. Poetry, in particular, reached new heights. Poets such as Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang Wei crafted verses that blended personal emotion, political commentary, nature, and philosophical insight. These works were not merely aesthetic expressions, but vehicles for public discourse and personal reflection. Poetry became a hallmark of educated society, with officials and scholars often required to compose and recite verses as part of their public lives. Painting and calligraphy also matured into formalized arts. Landscapes, court scenes, and religious themes appeared on silk scrolls and murals, reflecting both technical refinement and spiritual depth. Buddhism, Daoism, and Confucianism all influenced Tang aesthetics, creating a dynamic artistic environment. Religion played a central role in Tang society. Buddhism, especially in its Mahayana forms, continued to flourish, supported by imperial patronage and popular devotion. The Tang court sponsored the construction of temples, monasteries, and colossal statues. Pilgrims traveled to India to retrieve sacred texts, most notably the monk Xuanzang, whose journey and translations had a lasting impact on Chinese Buddhism. His pilgrimage would later be fictionalized in the classic novel Journey to the West. Tang China was also a center of religious pluralism. Alongside Buddhism, Daoism enjoyed imperial support and institutional development. Nestorian Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Islam arrived via the Silk Road and established small but active communities. While Confucianism remained the official state ideology, Tang society was marked by a remarkable degree of tolerance and synthesis among different belief systems. One of the most extraordinary episodes in Tang history occurred during the reign of Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to officially rule as emperor. Rising from the ranks of court concubines, she skillfully navigated palace politics and declared herself ruler in the late 7th century. Empress Wu established her own dynasty, the Zhou, which interrupted Tang rule for a brief period. Though controversial, her reign was marked by effective administration, expansion of the civil service system, and promotion of Buddhism as a state religion. After her death, Tang rule was restored, and the dynasty entered its peak under Emperor Xuanzang, also known as Emperor Ming of Tang. His early reign saw economic growth, cultural flourishing, and administrative reforms. However, in his later years, the court became increasingly extravagant and detached from social realities. The emperor's infatuation with his consort Yang Guifei and the rise of her powerful relatives sowed discord within the court. This internal instability contributed to the outbreak of the Anlushan Rebellion in the mid-8th century, one of the most devastating conflicts in Chinese history. Anlushan, a military governor of mixed Sogdian and Turkic descent, rebelled against the central government, declaring himself emperor of a rival dynasty. The rebellion lasted for nearly a decade and caused massive destruction, population loss, and economic disruption. Although the Tang eventually suppressed the rebellion, the empire never fully recovered. The central government became increasingly reliant on military governors, known as jiedushi, who commanded their own armies and often acted independently of the court. These regional powers weakened the authority of the emperor and complicated governance. In the late Tang period, natural disasters, peasant uprisings, and court corruption further undermined stability. Buddhist institutions, once pillars of Tang society, were targeted in state-sponsored persecutions aimed at reclaiming land and wealth. The court lost control over the provinces, and warlords vied for dominance. In the year 907, the last Tang emperor was forced to abdicate, marking the end of the dynasty. Yet even in decline, the Tang left a monumental legacy. Its achievements in administration, literature, art, and international diplomacy shaped Chinese civilization for centuries. The Tang vision of a unified, cosmopolitan, and confident China would serve as a model for future dynasties and a source of pride for generations. The collapse of the Tang dynasty in the year 907 did not plunge China into chaos, but rather into a new phase of regional fragmentation and political experimentation. Known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, this era lasted for just over half a century. Though often overshadowed by the grandeur of the Tang and the unity of the Song, these decades were marked by important developments in administration, military organization, and cultural life. It was a time when old structures broke down, new powers emerged, and the groundwork was laid for future reunification. The 5 dynasties were a succession of short-lived imperial regimes that controlled the northern heartland, particularly around the old capital of Kaifeng. These dynasties, later Liang, later Tang, later Jin, later Han, and later Zhou, rose and fell in quick succession, often founded by military commanders who seized power through force. Despite their brevity, they preserved many of the institutions of imperial rule, including central bureaucracy, tax systems, and the civil service examinations. In contrast, the 10 kingdoms flourished primarily in the south and southwest, regions that had long remained less centralized and more commercially vibrant. These kingdoms included Wu, Wu Yue, Min, Chu, Southern Han, Southern Tang, and several others. Some were ruled by former Tang officials or regional governors who asserted local autonomy. Others were led by ambitious warlords or aristocratic families. While none of these states sought full imperial legitimacy on a nationwide scale, many governed effectively and fostered rich cultural traditions. One of the defining features of this period was the continued militarization of politics. The Jidushi, or regional military governors who had gained prominence in the late Tang, remained powerful figures. In the north, these generals often competed for dominance over the imperial court, using their armies to depose one dynasty and install another. In the south, military leaders formed semi-independent courts, issuing their own coins, maintaining their own tax systems, and negotiating foreign relations. Despite political instability, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period was not marked by constant warfare or economic collapse. In many regions, agriculture flourished, commerce expanded, and urban centers grew. Southern China, in particular, experienced unprecedented prosperity. Ports such as Guangzhou and Quanzhou became hubs of maritime trade, connecting China with Southeast Asia, India, and even the Islamic world. This period also saw technological and administrative innovation. One of the most influential changes was the refinement of the civil service examination system. Although examinations had existed under previous dynasties, the 5 dynasties period witnessed a renewed emphasis on recruiting officials through competitive exams. Literacy in Confucian classics became increasingly important, gradually reducing the influence of aristocratic lineage in favor of educational merit. The printing of books, still in its early stages, also began to accelerate. Woodblock printing, which had been developed during the Tang, was used to reproduce Buddhist texts, Confucian classics, and even popular stories. This increased access to knowledge and helped disseminate a shared cultural identity, even in the absence of political unity. In terms of governance, several of the southern kingdoms implemented effective regional policies. For example, the kingdom of Wu Yue, centered in what is now Zhejiang province, maintained stable rule for over 8 decades under the Qian family. It invested heavily in infrastructure, including flood control, irrigation, and temple construction. Wu Yue rulers promoted Buddhism and supported artistic production, leaving behind a legacy of stone pagodas and inscriptions that still survive today. The southern Tang, with its capital at Jinling, modern Nanjing, also stood out as a center of refinement and culture. Its court attracted poets, painters, and musicians, continuing the Tang tradition of elite patronage of the arts. Southern Tang rulers claimed to be heirs of the Tang dynasty, adopting its symbols and rituals, though they lacked the military strength to reunify the country. Meanwhile, in the north, each of the 5 dynasties tried to consolidate power but faced repeated challenges. The later Liang, established by Zhou Wen, a former rebel general, was notorious for its brutality and was soon replaced by the later Tang. Successive dynasties depended heavily on military backing and often ruled through authoritarian means. However, they maintained imperial institutions and supported cultural continuity, ensuring that the ideal of a unified empire did not vanish. Ethnic diversity also played an important role during this period. In the north, nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples such as the Khitan, Shatuo Turks, and Tanguts became increasingly involved in Chinese politics. The later Tang and later Jin, for instance, relied heavily on alliances with steppe groups. In some cases, Chinese rulers ceded territory to these allies in exchange for military support, revealing the fragility of their power. The Khitan, in particular, would go on to found the Liao dynasty, a powerful state in the northeast that maintained a dual administrative structure, governing its nomadic population with tribal law while adopting Chinese bureaucratic practices for its sedentary subjects. The rise of the Liao illustrated how non-Han groups could adapt and participate in the broader political culture of the Chinese world. Religion remained a vibrant force during this era. Buddhism, though damaged by state-sponsored persecutions during the late Tang, continued to thrive in regional kingdoms. In the south, temple construction and monastic patronage were common, and Buddhist art regained its prominence. Daoism also experienced a revival, especially in local cults and ritual traditions. Meanwhile, Confucianism, though never disappearing, began to undergo deeper philosophical reflection that would eventually lead to the development of Neo-Confucianism during the Song. Artistic production was rich and diverse. Landscape painting emerged as a dominant genre, with painters using ink and brush to capture natural scenes not only as representations of nature, but as expressions of philosophical ideals. Poetry remained a respected art form, and local courts competed to attract talented writers and scholars. The arts became both a symbol of legitimacy and a means of expressing the values of governance, virtue, and harmony. Although no single state was able to unify China during this period, the desire for reunification remained a potent political ideal. Southern kingdoms often paid symbolic tribute to northern dynasties, while northern rulers invoked the legacy of the Tang to justify their claims. The idea of the mandate of heaven still carried weight, even in fragmented times. The end of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period came not through one final conquest, but through the steady rise of a new power in the north. A general named Zhou Kuangyin, serving under the later Zhou dynasty, seized power in a peaceful coup known as the Qiao Mutiny. In the year 960, he declared himself Emperor Taizu of Song and established the Song dynasty, ushering in a new era of unification, innovation, and civil governance. In retrospect, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period served as a critical bridge between 2 major dynastic ages. While politically fragmented, it was intellectually and culturally dynamic. The foundations of the Song's success, land reforms, civil service expansion, commercial growth, and artistic innovation, were laid during this time of division. It revealed that even in the absence of imperial unity, Chinese civilization could adapt, endure, and evolve. With the founding of the Song dynasty in the year 960 of the Common Era, China entered a new era, one that was defined not by conquest and territorial expansion, but by economic dynamism, bureaucratic sophistication, and intellectual achievement. Emerging from the fragmentation of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, the Song marked a turning point in Chinese history. Under its rule, the empire became more urbanized, more literate, and more technologically advanced than ever before. The dynasty was founded by Zhou Kuangyin, a general of the later Zhou state, who seized the throne in a relatively peaceful coup known as the Qiao Mutiny. Taking the title Emperor Taizu of Song, he quickly moved to consolidate power and reduce the influence of military governors who had dominated Chinese politics since the late Tang era. He accomplished this by rotating generals, strengthening the civil bureaucracy, and emphasizing the centralization of authority under the imperial court. This shift toward civil governance became a hallmark of the Song dynasty. The civil service examination system was expanded dramatically, becoming the primary means by which officials were selected. Examinations tested knowledge of Confucian texts, poetry composition, and administrative policy. Success in the exams brought prestige, wealth, and social mobility. As a result, a scholar official class emerged, deeply steeped in Confucian ideals and loyal to the state. To support this system, a broad educational infrastructure developed. Private academies, state schools, and local instruction became widespread. Literacy rates increased, and families invested in education as a path to success. The role of family lineage began to decline in favor of meritocratic achievement, at least in theory. While elite families still held advantages, the Song system rewarded intellectual effort and bureaucratic skill. The Song capital, initially at Kaifeng during the Northern Song period, became one of the largest and most vibrant cities in the world. With its bustling markets, craft workshops, libraries, temples, and government offices, Kaifeng was a showcase of urban life. The city was densely populated, highly organized, and equipped with a sophisticated system of water supply and waste management. Night markets operated under the glow of lanterns, and printed books were sold in shops catering to a growing reading public. This growth was fueled by a commercial revolution that transformed the Chinese economy. The widespread use of paper money, first introduced under the Song, facilitated trade and reduced the risks associated with transporting metal coinage. Innovations in accounting, credit systems, and contract law helped merchants conduct business across vast distances. Agriculture also advanced. The introduction of fast-ripening rice from Champa, in modern-day Vietnam, allowed for multiple harvests per year, significantly boosting food production. Irrigation techniques, land reclamation, and improved tools supported a growing population and freed labor for other pursuits. The Song era witnessed a remarkable expansion in science and technology. Printing, especially woodblock and later movable type, enabled the mass production of texts, aiding education, religious dissemination, and administration. One of the earliest printed encyclopedias, the imperially commissioned collection of illustrations and explanations of the three powers, combined scientific knowledge with artistic skill. In medicine, pharmacology, and astronomy, Song scholars compiled comprehensive treatises. Su Song, a polymath of the 11th century, created an astronomical clock tower that combined mechanical engineering with precise astronomical observation. The invention of gunpowder, first recorded during the Tang, was further developed in the Song period. While initially used for fireworks and signaling, it soon found military applications in bombs and primitive firearms. Maritime technology also flourished. Magnetic compasses allowed for long-distance navigation, contributing to expanded sea trade. Chinese ships, equipped with watertight bulkheads and stern-post rudders, sailed across the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean. Song merchants traded ceramics, silk, and tea for spices, pearls, and other exotic goods from Southeast Asia, India, and the Islamic world. Philosophically, the Song period saw the rise of Neo-Confucianism, a revival and transformation of classical Confucian thought that incorporated metaphysical and ethical ideas. Leading thinkers such as Zhou sought to harmonize Confucianism with insights drawn from Buddhism and Daoism. Neo-Confucianism emphasized self-cultivation, moral responsibility, and a rational order underlying the cosmos. Zhou's commentaries on the Confucian classics became central to the imperial examination curriculum for centuries to come. Culturally, the Song period was rich in art and literature. Landscape painting reached its zenith, with artists such as Fan Quan and Guo Xi creating vast meditative scrolls that reflected both natural beauty and philosophical depth. Poetry and prose flourished, with writers exploring personal expression, political reflection, and philosophical inquiry. Calligraphy remained a supreme art form, and ceramics achieved technical perfection. Porcelain, with its delicate glazing and intricate designs, became a major export item and a symbol of refined taste. Yet, despite its internal brilliance, the Song dynasty faced significant military challenges. The early emperors had deliberately curtailed the power of the military to prevent warlordism, but this left the dynasty vulnerable to external threats. In the north, the Liao dynasty, ruled by the Khitan, maintained pressure on Song borders and extracted tribute through uneasy treaties. In the early 12th century, the Song attempted to form an alliance with a rising power to the northeast, the Jurchen, who soon overthrew the Liao and established the Jin dynasty. However, the Jin soon turned on the Song, capturing the northern capital of Kaifeng in a devastating invasion. The reigning emperor and his court were taken hostage, and the northern half of the empire was lost. This event marked the end of the northern Song and the beginning of the southern Song, with the new capital established at Hangzhou. Despite this setback, the southern Song court retained legitimacy and oversaw a cultural and economic resurgence. Hangzhou, with its scenic location by the West Lake, became a center of trade, learning, and art. Foreign visitors remarked on its beauty, organization, and sophistication. The Southern Song also invested heavily in naval defense, building a powerful navy to protect its coastline and commercial interests. Still, the dynasty remained under constant threat from the north. The final blow would come in the 13th century, not from a neighboring Chinese regime, but from a foreign power of unprecedented scale. The Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Kublai Khan, launched a sustained campaign to conquer the Southern Song. After decades of resistance, Song defenses finally crumbled. In the year 1279, the last Song emperor, a child at the time, was taken out to sea by loyalists during the final battle. As defeat became inevitable, a court official is said to have leapt into the waves with the young emperor in his arms, bringing the dynasty to a tragic end. The fall of the Song dynasty marked the close of one of the most intellectually vibrant and economically advanced periods in Chinese history. Though it fell to foreign conquest, the Song legacy endured through its innovations, its civil institutions, and its cultural achievements. In the 13th century, the world shifted. From the grasslands of the Eurasian steppe rose a force that would reshape not only the Chinese world, but the entire structure of Afro-Eurasian history. The Mongol conquests, under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his descendants, created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. For China, the Mongol invasion did not simply mark a dynastic change. It brought the conclusion of the ancient era and the beginning of something fundamentally new. By the time the Mongols reached the Southern Song, they had already subdued northern China, Central Asia, Persia, and the eastern reaches of Europe. In China, the conquest began under Ögedei Khan and was completed under Kublai Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan. After years of protracted warfare, logistical coordination, and siege operations, including naval engagements, the Mongols finally succeeded in breaking the Song resistance. In the year 1271, Kublai Khan declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty, naming himself Emperor Shizhu of Yuan. 8 years later, in 1279, the Southern Song court fell. China was now fully under foreign rule, an unprecedented moment in its long history. The Yuan capital was established in Dadu, modern-day Beijing, marking a geographic shift in the imperial center. From the outset, Kublai Khan adopted many elements of Chinese governance, including Confucian administration, court rituals, and legal codes. Yet, he also maintained the Mongol identity of his court, creating a dual structure that favored Mongols and Central Asians over native Han elites in key positions. This era introduced new hierarchies, both social and ethnic. Mongols occupied the highest tier, followed by Central Asians, then Northern Chinese, with Southern Chinese at the bottom of the administrative order. While the Yuan rulers sought to integrate Chinese institutions into their empire, they did not attempt full cultural assimilation. This approach generated a measure of administrative efficiency, but also deep resentment among the Chinese population. Nevertheless, the Yuan dynasty brought remarkable connectivity. The empire's vast network facilitated trade, migration, and communication across Eurasia. Chinese goods, particularly porcelain, silk, and printed texts, reached markets as far as the Middle East and Europe. Foreigners, such as Marco Polo, traveled to China and documented what they saw, bringing Chinese civilization into broader global awareness. The Mongol administration also preserved and extended many scientific and technological practices. Advances in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine continued under imperial patronage. The Yuan period saw improved maps, refined calendars, and the further development of printing techniques. Yet beneath these accomplishments lay chronic instability. Rebellions, economic strain, and internal divisions plagued the dynasty. Mongol rule, while formidable, lacked deep cultural legitimacy among the Chinese. Gradually, dissatisfaction grew among the southern gentry, Buddhist clergy, and impoverished peasants. Natural disasters and epidemics further eroded Yuan authority. In the mid-14th century, a series of rebellions erupted across the empire. Among the rebel leaders was Zhou Yuanzhang, a former monk and peasant who led a disciplined movement rooted in the Red Turban Rebellion. In the year 1368, Zhou captured Dadu and declared the founding of the Ming Dynasty. The Yuan court retreated to the steppe, and with their departure, China returned to native rule. With the fall of the Yuan, the ancient era of Chinese history, defined by dynastic cycles, agrarian empires, Confucian bureaucracy, and evolving philosophical synthesis, came to a close. The Ming Dynasty, and later the Qing, would build upon this foundation. But they did so in a different world, one shaped by global exchange, changing technologies, and shifting political models. Across more than 3,000 years, from the Neolithic settlements of the Yellow River to the fall of the Yuan dynasty, China experienced a long and complex transformation. What began as small agrarian communities evolved into one of the most continuous and sophisticated civilizations in human history. Certain themes run through this history: the search for moral governance, the tension between central authority and regional autonomy, the constant negotiation between tradition and innovation, and the enduring effort to balance order and adaptability. Rulers rose and fell, philosophies competed and merged, but the broader cultural identity remained strikingly resilient. What changed most over time was scale and complexity. States grew larger, bureaucracies more refined, and technologies more advanced. Trade expanded China's horizons, while foreign invasions tested its cohesion. Ideas from Buddhism, Daoism, and foreign faiths were not simply received, they were adapted, localized, and folded into the Chinese worldview. What remained consistent was a deep commitment to scholarship, civic order, and historical continuity. The importance placed on history itself, recording it, interpreting it, and learning from it, became one of the defining traits of Chinese civilization. Dynasties justified their rule by appealing to the past, and reformers grounded their innovations in earlier models. Even today, the echoes of ancient China are everywhere, in language, art, philosophy, political thought, and social values. From Confucian ethics to technological ingenuity, from centralized governance to literary tradition, the legacy of this long history continues to shape modern China and influence the wider world. To study the story of ancient China is not simply to catalog emperors or recount battles. It is to witness how a civilization grows, endures, and evolves across centuries of challenge and change. It reminds us that history is not static. It is a living conversation between past and present, rooted in memory, shaped by reflection, and always open to deeper understanding.